Hello, Kumkum.
Good morning. Good morning,
Good morning.
Kumkum D. Good morning. Kunal sir, good morning. This is Chandrani here.
Oh, hello, Chandrani. Yeah, good morning.
Sarita D. Good morning.
Good morning, Chandrani.
Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the JU History Workshop on Studying History, Perspectives and Sources. We are continuing with the section on early Indian history. Today, the first session is on studying the early history of India, reading texts. Dr. Pritha Bhattacharya is unable to make her presentation due to unavoidable circumstances. The inconvenience is regretted. The session begins with the eminent historian, Professor Kumkum Roy, formerly of the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She is going to deliver a talk entitled On Reading the Arthashastra. I now welcome Professor Roy. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I also wanted to thank the organizers for an extremely interesting exercise. I attended part of the session yesterday and I learned a great deal from the presentations. And these, I think, are particularly important in our current location. I will begin by just putting forward certain general ideas which we are probably all familiar with, but it is useful to remind ourselves of that and then move on to the Arthashastra. And in doing that, I'm drawing on the work of Paul Cohen called History in Three Keys, where he talks about event, experience, and myth. And one of the things that he mentions about history, he mentions 2 or 3 things which are worth keeping in mind, is that writing history invariably involves compression and simplification. There is no history that can ever be complete. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. The other point that he makes is about the fact that historians' main task is to understand and explain. And the third, in doing so, to be as accurate as possible, even if accuracy is never 100%. But we are committed to remaining accurate. I won't go into the discussion that he has on the experience of people who are part of historical processes and the way in which that can be documented and recovered. That is an interesting discussion, but not for the present. But he does also make an interesting point, several points about why myths in particular become attractive for people and sometimes can overwhelm our historical understanding. And I think this for us is a particularly useful reminder at the present juncture where we are located, where we find that there is a considerable amount of myth making about early India that has become very, very popular and all pervasive. So one of the things that he points out, and which is useful for us to remember, is that myths are often far more attractive than what we write or produce as historians or scholars of history. They seem to be much more liberating in many ways, and sometimes they are much more empowering. So they have a certain attraction which comes from a different level. But what is also important, and this is something that those of us who engage in responding to myths probably need to keep in mind, is that myths are not always entirely inaccurate, but they rest on distortion. They also rest on oversimplification. They omit certain things which may not be considered appropriate from the perspective of the myth makers, and they run counter to the intentions of the myth maker. They also tend to essentialize, and because they essentialize, they provide a simple understanding where complex nuances can be ignored. So, and myths, again, as we are very well aware at present, can be conveyed through a whole range of strategies. They need not necessarily be texts. They can take the form of films, oral presentations, all kinds of other modes of communication. Now with that, I just wanted to briefly run through what we will be looking at in the next few half an hour or so. These questions that we'll be looking at can be posed about texts in general, but some of them are specific to the Arthashastra. And it's useful to remember that the Arthashastra is amongst the texts, and the so-called author of the text, Chanakya or Kautilya, has been subjected to considerable myth-making. So that is something that we can keep in the background for the moment as we look at what we as historians can do when we look at the text. So I briefly touch on questions of authorship and circulation in the ancient period or the pre-modern period, the structure of the text, its features, issues of dating, how we can use it, strategies of translation, what kind of information does it provide about society, also about the regulation of society, and the kind of administrative structures and administrative personnel that it mentions. And for this, what I've done is apart from the general material, we'll be looking a bit closely at one small section of the text just to see how we can handle it. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. Now, the Arthashastra is a unique text in many ways, and it has been subjected to intense scholarly attention. So while it was mentioned in texts and commentaries throughout the ancient, medieval, and what is now being called the early modern period, manuscripts of the text were found only about 100 years ago. And these were published in 1909 by Shama Shastri, who also published the first English translation in 1915. Subsequently, R.P. Kangle, and we will be relying on his translation, he published a critical edition and a translation, as well as a study of the text in 3 parts in the 1960s. And more recently, Patrick Oliver has published a translation titled King, Governance and Law in Ancient India in 2013. Can you move on to the next slide? Yeah. So although there were very few surviving manuscripts of the text, it was something that was, it was a text which was evidently known throughout this period to authors of texts such as the Kama Sutra, to playwrights such as Vishakha Datta, whose Mudra Rakshas is perhaps one of the interesting examples of how you have this process of myth making, which I just mentioned, which seems to have begun, in this case, in the Gupta period, looking back to the Mauryan Empire. So it does seem that by the early historical period and certainly in the early medieval period, it was a well-known text amongst certain circles. The next one. The text has 3 kinds of divisions. These include 15 books or adhikaranas. And within these, we find chapters or adhyayas. There's a total of 150 chapters. You also have another overlapping division that is called the prakaranas, and this divides the same text into 180 units. The text itself is mainly in prose, but each chapter usually concludes with a verse or a set of verses. And the chapters in the books vary considerably in length. Book 2, from which we will be looking at a small portion, is the longest book, and book 11 is the shortest. The next one. Briefly to outline the context, the first book deals with the scope of the text, ministers, secret service, the king and the household. Book 2 with the bureaucracy. Book 3 to 5 deal with legal disputes and their resolution. Book 6 and 7 deal with matters of war and peace. Book 8 with problems of kingship. Books 9 and 10 with warfare. Book 11 with non-monarchical states. Books 12 and 13 with interstate relations. Book 14 with what is translated as occult practices. And book 15 lays down the definitions that help us understand the text. The next one. And briefly, books 1 to 5 deal with internal matters of the state, whereas books 6 to 14 deal with relations with other states and warfare. And the section that we are considering is the 4th adhyay of the 2nd adhikarana. And within the text, we can see that there are numbers used for citation. The first number usually refers to the adhikarana, the second to the adhyaya, and the third to the specific sutra. The next one. The distinctive features of the text include an attempt to both abstract and generalize. And this is most evident in the fact that it does not mention any specific kingdom such as Magadha. In other words, the author evidently wanted his work to be applicable in a range of situations. And throughout, I use the singular author, although, as we can see, this is work that emerged over a long period and through a collective process. So author is just being used as a convenient shorthand. It's not something which is literally true. So at the same time, when we read the text, one notices that it is extremely detailed and it is rooted in a specific socio-political economic milieu. It is also evident that the text was meant for a specific audience, primarily kings or those who aspired to be kings and ministers. It was not meant for ordinary people. Interestingly, while the king was conceptualized as an absolute monarch, the text also creates space for negotiation as well as for a paternalistic ideal of kingship. And of course, what distinguishes the text also is its technical vocabulary. Next one. In terms of dating, while it is likely that some sections of the text, including the one that we are looking at present, pertain to the Mauryan period, that is roughly the 4th to the 2nd centuries BC, it is possible that other parts were added at a later stage. Scholars who attempt to date the text usually do so on the basis of language, style, similarities with or differences from other texts, as well as in terms of content. In the case of the Arthashastra, and this is especially interesting in the light of the discussion that we had yesterday during Professor Osman Bakurachi's presentation about the coinage, it is significant that the Arthashastra does not mention gold coins, even as it is familiar with monetary transactions. So this indicates a date prior to the 2nd or the 1st century BC, when the Indo-Greek rulers began issuing gold coins, followed by the Kushanites. Also, Book 11 is devoted to the Sanghas as political institutions. While these non-monarchical institutions survived till the Gupta period, it is likely that they were strongest during the earlier period. It is therefore possible that large parts of the text belong to a relatively early period. And there is, again, the possibility of recognizing layers within the text. Olivelle points out, for example, that books 1 to 4, 6 to 7, 9 to 10, and 13 are earlier, while the rest may be later editions. And one of the bases on which he identifies these is by highlighting discrepancies between titles of books or chapters and their contents. I will not go into the details of this at the moment, but this is something that he has argued for. There are interesting elements. For example, you can see that books 9 and 10 deal with preparation of warfare. Book 11 and 12 seem to talk about other things. And book 13 then again goes back to capturing an enemy's fort. So there does seem to be a certain kind of discrepancy between the text and the way in which it is organized. Also, I think this is interesting in the light of what we were talking about yesterday, the problems of correlating text with material evidence. Again, this is something that Olivelle points out. We know from the excavations at Pataliputra that the fortifications of what is probably the Mauryan city were wooden fortifications. And it is interesting that the provisions for the for fortification in the Arthashastra very categorically forbid the use of wood because it is liable to catch fire. So either this could be an indication that the provisions were not always followed, or it might point to other dimensions of the problem of using one or the other. So the Arthashastra provides us with a vast amount of extremely detailed information, including vivid details of material resources, social categories, etc. And this is information that is valuable for us because it provides us with an understanding of the conditions that were prevailing at the time. And this is information that the author takes for granted, assumes others are familiar with it, and he uses it as a background for whatever he wishes to prescribe. It's also interesting to see how the first the translation that Kangle offers, it is one which is extremely cautious. And the excerpt which you see on the screen, it details this. He says that it is meant to provide as accurate a rendering as possible. He points out the difficulties. He points out the uncertainties. He says that he is diffident. He may have misunderstood things. And again, you can see the humility of the scholar, his diffidence. There are no brash kind of remarks that suggest that he is claiming or asserting that he is the sole authority about this. Can we go to the next one? Yeah. One of the examples of this kind of translation one can see is in the title of the book, the chapter that we're looking at from book 2. The Sanskrit title is Durga Nivesha, and Kangle translates this as layout of the fortified city, while Olivelle translates it as layout of a fort. Now, what is clear is that the term for city does not occur in the title, but Kangle introduces it because the chapter itself describes the city. So it is evident that it is implied. Olivelle's translation in this case, we can see, is much more literal, but there is that difference between the two of them that we can notice. And the next one. Now, if you turn to specific sections of the text, we find that 246, which is part of what we are looking at, part of the section that we're looking at, you find a sentence which says, on an excellent building site fit for the four Varnas to live on, the royal residence should be erected. If you have the text with you, you will notice that the words "should be erected" are inserted by Kangle within brackets. And he does that in order to complete the sentence. Each language has certain structural elements. So while "should be erected" would be understood by a Sanskrit knowing readership, it would not be understood by others, and therefore it has been inserted in order to explain the meaning. The next one, yeah. Now, also note that the statement that we've just looked at, it mentions the 4 varnas. So this suggests that both the author and his audience were familiar with the 4-fold varna order, and therefore he refers to this without needing to explain anything further. Similarly, 248 refers to the preceptor and the chaplain. The terms used in Sanskrit are Acharya and Purohita. And evidently, these Brahmins were considered important from the point of view of the king. However, they are not explicitly identified as Brahmins. In this case, it was probably so well understood that these would be high status men that it did not need to be spelled out categorically. In other words, it gives us an idea about the assumptions that were probably shared by the author and his audience. When we turn to the next statement, we find 249, we find mention of Kshatriyas, but we also find others who are not identified in terms of Varna. These include the Gandha Malya Rasa Panya, that is those who deal in perfumes, flowers, and liquids. Once again, these occupational categories obviously existed in society, as did others who dealt with cooked food, wine, meat, courtesans, and dancers. Another set of categories is mentioned in 2413, where we find several craft groups listed: workers in wool, yarn, bamboo, leather, armor, weapons, shields. And a 4th set is mentioned, who include the metal worker and the manikara, or somebody who worked in jewels. And finally, you have a mention of space meant for guilds as well as for foreign merchants. The next one. So this preliminary reading then gives us an understanding of a complex social order where Varna identities were important, but where other identities that could not be neatly fitted within the Varna categories also existed. And what is significant is that the text attempts to regulate residence for each of these categories. So if we turn to 249, we find that it is said that all the categories listed, as well as the Kshatriyas, should live in the eastern part of the settlement. Similarly, all those mentioned in 2411, as well as the Vaishyas, should live in the southern part. And all those mentioned in 2413, as well as the Shudras, should live in the western part. And all those mentioned in 2415, as well as the Brahmins, should reside in the northern part. We are not sure whether these provisions were invariably implemented, but they give us a sense that kings were expected to regulate the social order in general and social contact in particular. Further, we are told that heretics, the Pashandas and the Chandalas, should live on the outskirts of the cremation ground. Social differentiation extends to cremation, where if we consider provision number 2421, we find that it says that the northeastern cremation ground is reserved for the so-called best Varnas, the Varnottama in Sanskrit, while the southern one is reserved for the other Varnas, the Varnavaras in Sanskrit. In other words, we can see an attempt to enforce social differentiation both in life and in death. What is also worth noting is that this provision is backed by a punitive clause 2422, stating that any violation can be fined. This is defined as the lowest fine for violence, mentioned as the Sahasa Danda, which would range from 48 to 96 manas. The next one. If we turn to provision 2410, we find mention of the storehouse or the Bhandagara, the record office and audit office, the Akshapatala, the quarters for workmen, as well as store for forest produce and the armory. This gives us an idea of some of the major departments of the administration. We get a sense that goods were procured and stored within the palace or in close proximity to it, and that keeping records as well as maintaining arms were important. It thus gives us a glimpse of state structures and their functions, including acquiring resources, keeping records, and supporting an army. We also get a sense of administrative divisions. If we turn to 244, we find mention of the Dronamukha, the Sthaniya, the countryside, which is worship of various deities, and the terms used for shrines in Arkoshtha and Griha. There is also mention of deities associated with dwelling places, the Vastu Devatas, as well as those associated with different dwaras or gates. Other works of construction mentioned include shrines or chaityas, holy places, Punyasthan, and groves or vana, and waterworks or the Setubandha. There are other structures that are mentioned. These include the boundaries for the householders or the kutumbins to indicate the area of workshops, as also arrangements for flower and fruit gardens, as well as for storing grain, dhanya, and merchandise, panya. Besides, wells were to be built for every 10 families of rulers. The next one. Other arrangements include organizing an army consisting of elephants, horses, chariots, infantry, with the provision for more than one chief or a mukhya to ensure that they kept one another in check through mutual fear. Let us also then turn next to a list of things that the state was expected to store. These include fat, grain, sugar, salt, perfume, medicine, dried vegetables, fodder, dried meat, hay, wood, metals, hides, charcoal, tendons, poisons, horns, bamboos, bark, strong timber, weapons, shields, and stones. Now, I think what is interesting for us is to think through about how each of these resources would be acquired. How would these provisions have been implemented? What would they have meant for the king, for the state, in terms of administrative infrastructure, the resources, etc.? And how would the relationship with different categories which would have supplied these very varied resources, which obviously were regarded as significant enough to be listed, what were the implications of these? How would these have been provided? How would these have been acquired? And what are their significance? So one can see then that even if we look at a small section of a text, it can provide us with many fresh questions to investigate and open up fresh possibilities. So basically, I think it is important for us as scholars to look at these texts carefully and to see what we can make of them and to share these ideas as widely as possible with future students of history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarti. Now we have, just give me a minute.
I think Manisha is kind of finding it difficult, maybe lost her connectivity. Can I come in her place?
Sure,
So-
Dr. B, please.
Yes. So actually, I would like to thank Professor Roy for this truly enlightening lecture. And I'm sure that a lot of questions will be asked because we are all very interested in not only in the text, but the way that Professor Roy has handled it and how she has actually raised a lot of points that we have to ponder on, and a lot of questions will come for this. So now we have with us another great historian from the same institutional background, and I welcome Professor Kunal Chakraborty, formerly of Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, to this session. Professor Chakraborty will be speaking on reading the Puranas for history. Kunalda, I hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nupur, for the introductory words. And let me state at the outset that the Puranas constitute such a large corpus of texts, unlike the Arthashastra, that I won't deal with the formation of the corpus, its history, what it contains, and so on. I will be looking primarily at how the historians have tended to look at these texts and what kind of histories it's possible to discover in these more or less religious texts, although these texts are so voluminous that it would be unwise to try and categorize it in any particular pigeonhole. Nevertheless, it's necessary to remember that these are primarily religious texts and arguably the largest repository of what Professor Rai had been saying, Brahmanical myths. And for a long time, historians had, or those early explorers of these texts, had taken them as such and didn't take them very seriously. However, it was Professor Romila Thapar who looked at that as a container of extremely significant historical information and created the methodology by which one can read these texts profitably and derive histories out of it. So I will be discussing primarily the works of Professor Thapar, but I will also create the background for the earlier attempts to look at the Puranas, and then I'll devote some time to an understanding of Professor Thapar's both method and conclusion, and then I'll look at my work on the Puranas. Professor Thapar may be said to have looked into the social history of politics in the Itihasa Purana tradition of the Puranas, and I look at the social history of religion in the same set of texts. The texts exactly are the same, but the same genre of texts, that is, the Puranas, and I'll say how even I was deeply influenced by Professor Thapar's questions and methods, and thereby lay down for the students who may be present how these texts can be utilized for writing history. So let me begin. For a long time, the Puranas were not considered a valid source for the reconstruction of early Indian history. In Brahmanism, quote-unquote, direct divine revelation ended with the Vedic Samhitas. The other later Vedic literature, through association with the Vedas, also acquired a high degree of sacredness. But the later Brahmanical texts were too numerous to constitute an authentic corpus of scripture of a status acceptable to all votaries of Brahmanism. Thus, while the Brahmanical law codes acquired the status of remembered truth that is, Smriti, the Puranas came to occupy a curious position with neither the unquestioned sanctity of the Vedas nor the decisive normative significance of the Smritis. European scholars who began to write about the Puranas from the mid-19th century to some extent treated these texts as repositories of fantastic tales about gods and demons, which contaminated the high seriousness and idealism of the Vedas. H. Wilson's translation of the Vishnu Purana contains a long preface which may be considered the first systematic and scholarly statement in English on Puranic literature. This book was published in 1840, long before the manuscript of the Arthashastra was discovered and published. In his preface, Wilson remarked that the Puranas are sectarian in character, which indeed is true, but the conclusion he drew from this was that these texts were composed by, quote, pious frauds for temporary purposes, unquote, and, quote, in subservience to sectarian impostures, unquote, and therefore cannot be considered as authoritative. During the second half of the 19th century, a number of books on the history of Brahminical religion were published, in which the Puranas were treated with indifference. In these, the preference for Vedism as the true religion of the Hindus compared to the Puranic debasement is inescapable. A conspicuous exception to this trend was F. E. Parjitar, who wrote two books in the early decades of the 20th century on the historical traditions in ancient India, based on the testimony of primarily the Puranas and also of the epics. He took the Puranas seriously and argued that, as the oral tradition would retain some memory of the early kings, the genealogies contained in the Puranas were based initially on some authentic version of the past. Thus, Parjitar attempted to identify the different descent groups mentioned in the genealogical sections of the early Puranas with various ruling families. Unfortunately, however, he assumed that Indian history began with the Aryans and argued that the Puranic genealogies reflect Aryan expansion in India. He therefore identified the descent groups in consonance with the notion of quote-unquote races, such as Aryans and Dravidians, which was acceptable to the historians of his time. But the Puranas do not refer to the Aryan invasion or suggest a racial difference between the Aryans and the non-Aryans. On the contrary, the Puranas reveal the presence of many societies with social, linguistic, and ritual differences that caused internal dislocations. They do not conform to two confrontational systems. Evidently, Parjitar's approach was based on faulty assumptions, and his conclusions were therefore misleading. He nonetheless provided the Puranas with a degree of respectability as a repository of historical information. A number of historians after Parjitar attempted to reconstruct early Indian history on the basis of Puranic genealogies. However, while some of them attempted to work out definitive chronologies of ruling kings and dynasties, others shared Perdita's reliance on the race theory and treated the data as mapping the spread of the Aryans in India. Just as the race theory proved to be untenable, the chronologies were arbitrary as well. Just a moment. I'm sorry about this interruption. As I was saying, that just as the race theory proved to be untenable, the chronologies were arbitrary, as well as because of the variations in the genealogical lists and absence of correlations with other sources. Thus, the attitude towards the Puranas swung from one extreme to the other, namely from complete rejection to literal acceptance of the data. The only exception was D.D. Kosambi, who, instead of reading the myths literally, creatively utilized them as a source reflecting historical processes. This was the prevailing attitude of the historians when Romila Thapar took them up for an intensive scrutiny. Between 1978 and 2013, Thapar wrote 7 essays in which she has explored the historical significance of the genealogical patterns as they appear in the early Puranas, that is, the Vamshanucharita sections of the early Puranas and the later Vamshavalis. She argued that the genealogies are not faithful records of the past, but are memories of social relations. Therefore, they have an important social function. Her analysis shows that genealogies became important at points of historical changes, either with the entry of new social groups or in periods of competition. In other words, the genealogies reveal a pattern that reflects socio-political change over a long period of time. Let me take a closer look at Thapar's reading of the genealogical lists. Of the genealogical lists. 4 of the 18 Mahapuranas, that is Vayu, Brahmanda, Matsya, and Vishnu, composed around the 4th-5th century CE, conform to the Puranic definition of Pancha Lakshana and contain a Vamshanucharita section or genealogy of rulers. Thapar begins with the assumption that instead of taking them literally, the historian should look for patterns in these genealogies, which can be read as ways of representing society. Social assumptions are implicit in myths and genealogies, and therefore they record social forms. They are also used to legitimize the present, thus providing a perspective on the past. The genealogical section of the early Puranas is a record of change from clan-based societies to monarchies. The skeletal genealogies, which are occasionally accompanied with a story that occur at major points of change, were initially compiled by the Bards, but were later taken over by the Brahmanas and reconstituted. With these hypotheses in mind, Thapar examined the genealogical chapter in the Vishnu Purana. She noticed that it consists of 3 sections with distinctly different patterns. The first deals with origins and is ensconced in cosmological time. The second consists of the lineages of the ruling clans, including the protagonists of the two epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They reflect a clan-based society prior to or in transition to the formation of states. The third section is a list of kings and dynasties, suggesting the establishment of the monarchical state. The first section records the rule of the seven Manus who, despite their descent from the gods, remain hazy figures. It was during the period of the seventh Manu that the Great Flood occurred. The flood is a marker of time, separating origins from later events. Manu survives the flood, and his children become ancestors to a succession. All are and Chandravamsha.
Kunalda, can you please go back because there was some problem. So we could not hear the last few sentences.
Nupundi, I think his connection is lost.
Oh, okay.
Kunalda, we would like to hear the last few sentences. Can you
No,
please?
but can you hear me now?
Yes. Now we
Oh.
can hear you.
Okay.
I think also it might be best because there is a problem with the video also. I think that actually you can put off the video and try out whether the connection remains okay.
Okay, I'll try that.
Okay.
Where's the video?
There's
The
this
video.
camera-like symbol. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yes, it's much better, I think.
Okay, that's easier for me too.
Okay.
I mean, instead of looking at the screen, it's much better that I look at the paper. I don't know at what point you lost me. I was speaking of the lists of rajas or heads of clans who are also referred to as kshatriyas. Did you hear that part?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Long lists of lineages of these kshatriyas follow. The two major descent groups are Suryavamsha and Chandravamsha. The Suryavamsha is said to have descended from the eldest son of Manu. The descent among them is patrilineal, going from eldest son to eldest son, and therefore primogeniture is of utmost importance to them. They occupy a clearly demarcated area in the Middle Ganga plain. The Chandravamsha, on the other hand, claims descent from the female half of androgynous Ila. They record all the male children of each generation and those females who were central to marriage alliances. Consequently, the genealogical pattern spreads out and includes a large area covering most of northern India. Segments claiming Chandravamsha descent were either those groups which had migrated away or those who had been assimilated within the lineage. This lack of homogeneity suggests that an early society might not have observed caste rules. The absence of state boundaries or the major infrastructure of a state indicates that these were societies without state. Rights over territory were established through birth, and in such societies, genealogies played a central role as descent groups were considered more important than institutions. The second time marker in the genealogies is the Mahabharata war, which terminates the existence of most of the clans. The genealogical pattern begins to change after the war, and the lineage of the Kshatriya families is replaced by the records of dynasties, such as the Mauryas and the Guptas, some of which are familiar to us from other sources. Dynasties point to a monarchy and a monarchical state. The record from now on comes to be written in the future tense and indicating a notable disjuncture. The genealogies are therefore recording a different political and social system from that of the clan-based society of the earlier lists. Royal legitimacy is not derived from birth, and relations of power are now more important than kinship links. We are told that kings will arise from families of Kshatriyas, mixed castes, Shudras, and foreigners, suggesting that political power was now open and negotiable. Thus, while in the clan-based societies, Kshatriyas assumed political authority, in state societies, those who acquired power claimed Kshatriya status. The genealogies thus make a statement. The transition from the earlier lineage pattern to the later dynastic pattern indicates what in modern parlance may be described as a change from a tribal society to a caste society with a state system. Thapar has thus discovered long-term historical processes in what is apparently a succession of lists of rulers. According to her, the Vamshanucharita is a Puranic attempt at giving an overview of the past. The historical perspectives are expressed in the genealogical patterns. The past is set out in different periods with the consciousness of a change in the historical context as factor of difference. The data is taken from the Vedic corpus and the epics, but is reformulated in a genealogical form. In the post-Gupta period, the ruling dynasties availed of these genealogies to forge affiliation with the earlier lineages in their search for respectability and status. The royal inscriptions of the early medieval period bear ample evidence of this effort. The later Vamshavalis, like some inscriptions, draw on the Puranic Vamshanucharitas for origin myths and genealogical material. The Vamshavalis, which are continuous narratives rather than mere king lists, are usually attempts on the part of the families that have recently acquired power to gain legitimacy and Kshatriya status. When such a claim is made, it shows that caste society has been established in the region over which the family rules. The gradual change of symbols in the Vamshavalis indicate the changing process of those who ruled. For instance, Thapar noticed an intriguing association of mouse, either as a name of an individual or a Gotra name, with the founder of many dynasties who are protagonists of the Vamshavalis. This possibly suggests tribal origins of the ruling family, which was sought to be transformed through connection with the Surya or Chandravamsha. The Vamshavalis thus maintained continuity with the Vamshanucharitas in both content and form. Despite Thapar's persistent engagement, The Puranas continued to be overlooked by historians, except a small group of Western scholars who often adopted an ahistorical, phenomenological approach to the study of religions. However, when I started to explore the evolution of the socio-religious processes in early medieval Bengal, my assumption that the Bengal Puranas provided the site for negotiation between the migrant Brahmanas and the indigenous ethnic communities for the construction of a syncretic, region-specific Puranic Hinduism, which eventually contributed to the shaping of the regional identity of Bengal, was to a large extent inspired by Thapar's essays on Puranic genealogies. I treated the Bengal Puranas as an account of socio-religious changes over a period of time, recorded in mythological language. I believe that if properly decoded, these would yield valuable historical data. It's difficult to trace the evolution of a process of interaction between various social groups spread over several centuries, particularly when the cultural matrix that governed the relationship of reciprocity, contestation, and domination is not always sharply defined, and the primary evidence is limited to a single category of texts, namely the Bengal Puranas, with an obvious Brahminical bias. Therefore, what I have attempted to do in this study is to follow the logic of cultural negotiation implicit in the Puranic records, and on that basis construct a discernible pattern of the manner in which the negotiations were conducted. Indeed, the process led to a product, the establishment of the Brahminical social order in Bengal, and a byproduct, the creation of a regional tradition. The Puranas were composed with a view to revitalize the Brahminical social order, which was seriously undermined during the early centuries of the Common Era. The Brahmanas attempted to meet this challenge by drawing people from the non-Brahminical fold into their sphere of influence. Thus, an interaction between the Brahminical tradition and the many local traditions was initiated, which resulted in the creation of a composite, syncretic socio-religious system delineated in the Puranas. But the level of assimilation achieved in these Puranas must have proved inadequate to suit the needs of a particular region, for when, from the post-Gupta period, large-scale Brahmana migrations started reaching areas peripheral to their influence, such as Bengal, a new category of regionally identifiable Puranas was composed. By the way, it's important to remember that the Mahapuranas, one of the major characteristic feature of the Mahapuranas is that they are regionally anonymous. We don't know where they were written, whereas most of the Upapuranas, as they are called, were regionally identifiable. I'm here speaking of those Puranas which were written either in Bengal or in very closely adjacent areas. Such as Bengal, a new category of regionally identifiable Puranas was composed, which offered a balance between Puranic Brahminical tradition and the exclusively local traditions of a region. The Bengal Puranas performed the delicate task of widening the scope of Brahmanism to incorporate as many local cultural elements as could be accommodated, and to induce as many local people to participate in this interactive process as was considered viable by the local Brahmanas without endangering their social supremacy. I call this technique of accomplishing this task the Puranic process. The process involved repeated assertion of Vedic authority on the one hand and strong affirmation of local popular customs on the other. The Bengal Puranas attempted to make these two appear consistent. I argue that the concept of great and little traditions, when viewed as elucidating a cultural continuum comprising ceaseless and multiple negotiations between many strands of Brahmanism and diverse local traditions, may serve as a workable taxonomic and heuristic device for an understanding of a fundamental civilizational process in India. Since we have only the Brahminical version of these negotiations, it may appear as if the Brahmanas could easily dictate terms. But in fact, there are enough indications in both the Puranic texts and available ethnographic accounts to suggest that Brahminical prescriptions were frequently contested. Brahminical acceptance of aspects of local cultures was also far from ungrudging. What was Brahminical in this assimilative synthesis was that Brahmanas assumed the initiative in the negotiations and that the cultural norms and objects created in the process had the stamp of Brahminical approval. The Brahmanas, immigrants in Bengal, were themselves vulnerable. They were a heterogeneous group and had to depend on the generosity of the local people and the state for survival. Moreover, they had to contend with Buddhism, which was already well entrenched in Bengal and enjoyed state patronage and local support. The Puranas, therefore, strove hard to gloss over the internal differentiation among the Brahmanas, projected Buddhism as Brahmanism's external and deviant other, and urged kings and householders to make gifts and pay honorarium to Brahmanas for conducting sacrifices and other rituals on their behalf. Moreover, the kings were instructed to follow the advice of the Brahmanas, exempt them from taxes, and above all, to grant them land and protect their property and privileges. This prescription appears to have had effect, for contemporary land grant inscriptions come remarkably close to the Puranas in endorsing the Brahminical worldview. As a matter of fact, those of you who are familiar with the land grant inscriptions would know that these contain towards the beginning and towards the end imprecatory verses where they say that the land that is being granted mustn't under any circumstances be transgressed or confiscated. And if one does so, then these are the punishments that will follow in this life and in afterlife. If we read the Bengal Puranas with these imprecatory verses, we are startled to see that the inscriptions were following the Puranas in literally in letter and spirit. You know, the similarities are simply too remarkable that we can actually escape the direct influence of these on the composition of the land grant texts. Buddhism, under the influence of the Tantras, lost its distinct profile as an institutional religion in the eyes of the laity. While the Buddha was appropriated as an incarnation of Vishnu, lay followers were eventually subsumed within the expansive framework of Brahmanism, which emerged triumphant, at least in the ideological sphere, by the 12th century. In the Bengal Puranas, we find adoption of the cult of the goddess to be the appropriate medium of assimilation of local cultural forms. The basic impulse behind the worship of the goddess is non-Sanskritic, indigenous origin. She is usually a virgin and warrior deity, residing in inaccessible mountains and forests, and is propitiated with animal sacrifice. This goddess was embellished with Brahmanical attributes. She was described as the repository of an abstract power or Shakti that energized all beings. This justified her inclusion into the Brahmanical pantheon without necessarily subverting her original identity or mode of worship. At the same time, a special category called Mula Prakriti or primordial nature was created, which made room for subsidiary or derived Prakritis. Once the divisibility of Prakriti was established in principle, Brahmanism could appropriate as many local goddesses as it perceived necessary as manifestations of the Mula Prakriti with the help of a single theological justification. The Bengal Puranas carefully constructed a plausible genealogy of the goddess and attached her manifestations to the important male members of the Brahmanical pantheon to ensure authenticity and a proper place for her in the divine hierarchy. The Vrata, a religious act of devotion and austerity undertaken for the fulfillment of specific desires, was the occasion for the dissemination of the Brahmanical message. Brahmanism transformed the character of the indigenous Vrata, drew upon its potential to arrange a gathering, widened its scope and inflated its number to make it as pervasive and frequent as possible. Purana recitation was mandatory during these performances, and this was the reason for such extraordinary emphasis on the Vrata in the Bengal Puranas. Several Vratas were observed in honor of specific goddesses, and the local legends connected with them were either restructured to make them fall in line with the archetypal Brahmanical myth about the goddess, or were composed afresh. These Vrata-kathas contained the quintessence of Brahmanism, which made the listeners familiar with the principal aspect of the Puranas in one sitting. Skilled professional narrators enjoyed the freedom and tacit Brahmanical sanction to interpret the Puranas in accordance with the demands of a particular situation. Thus, they could respond to local specificities and utilize the opportunity to make the Brahmanical doctrines appear attractive and compatible with the local traditions. The process of negotiation that began with the arrival of the Brahmanas in Bengal continued long after the completion of the composition of the Puranic texts. I have attempted to unravel the intricacies of a dialogical process enshrined in the Bengal Puranas, through which Brahmanism in Bengal succeeded in creating a public realm where diverse local elements could converge on a common core through the mediation of a supra-local agency. That's Brahmanism. Brahmanical culture, in creative interplay with the various local cultures, remolded itself into a regional Brahmanical culture characterized by a range of common cultural denominators and a shared vocabulary of value, which later proved to be typical of Bengal. Hence, the Puranic synthesis in Bengal, for me, was a point of departure, which generated cultural resources that enabled the little communities to transform themselves into a culturally identifiable regional community. This has been one of the early attempts to reconstruct the social history of a region on the basis of the testimony of primarily a set of Puranic texts. It was deeply informed by Thapar's reading of the Puranic genealogies, not merely in the general assumptions and method, but also in specific issues. For instance, quote, I'm quoting from Thapar, in the transition to caste through acculturation, local customary law and religious cults mediated between the stages of clan-based society and its transformation into a state. Should we see this process invariably as what has been called Sanskritization, or should we not also recognize situations where the reverse may have happened, where a particular form of Puranic Hinduism is a concession to local custom and belief, unquote. And this quote is taken from an article by Professor Thapar called Clan, Caste and Origin Myths in Early India. These are precisely some of the questions with which I approached my texts. Thapar's landmark intervention consists in directing our attention to the difference between history and historical tradition, in highlighting the fact that every society has its own ways of perceiving the past, which need not necessarily conform to the standard set by the Eurocentric notion of history that prioritizes India's own way can provide us with valuable information if, instead of looking for events, we adopt a strategy of discovering the underlying historical processes that account for long-term continuities and changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty, for enriching us so much with your lecture. We will now proceed with the discussion. The usual process that we followed yesterday will continue. I would request everybody to put all your questions in the chat box. Please mention the name of the resource person to whom you're addressing the question. Now, questions for Professor Roy.
I think there is one question.
Yes, ma'am, there's one question.
Yeah, Dr. Muhammad Ashraf Dar, who's asking, was there any relation between the symbolism of the directions and the assigning of the regions to different varnas? Kumkumdi, this is for you.
Yes. Thank you for that question. It's an interesting one. There are 2 or 3 things that we need to look at, even if we just consider this small section. One is, which is interesting, is that the enumeration begins from the east and it begins with the Kshatriyas. So you have the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, the Shudra and the Brahmana being placed in that order. So on the one hand, it seems to correspond partly with the Brahmanical order, partly with the, but not exactly also with the order that we find in Buddhist and Jain texts. So there is something that one can see over there, which is significant. The other thing which I find interesting about this particular passage is that if you look at the way in which it is listed, those who are in the eastern direction, along with the Kshatriyas, include those who are dealing with substances like fragrance, garlands, etc. Those associated with the Vaishyas are dealing with cooked food, meat, courtesans, dancers. With the Shudras, you have craft groups like the workers in wool, yarn, bamboo, leather, etc. And with the Brahmins, you have the Lohakara and the Manikara. So it's, one can see that on the one hand, there is an attempt to categorize these groups in terms of the Varna order, but there is also something that slips out of the Varna order as well. And it is that, I think, which is worth keeping in mind. So it's to allow us to think about relatively fluid, perhaps urban milieu, where on the one hand you have an ideal social order, but things are perhaps not always fitting in within that ideal normative pattern.
Ma'am, you have a second question.
Yes,
Yes.
there is another one by Aditya Bhattacharya,
Uh-huh.
and he's asking how can the commentaries like Sankararya's Jayamangala, etc., help in reading and understanding the Kautilya Arthashastra?
I think one of the things, that's again an interesting question. I think we need much more work about the context in which these commentaries emerged, because they will tell us about the particular time and the context within which you have the development of these commentarial traditions. All commentaries definitely help us to understand the texts, and but they also need to be looked at in terms of the time and space within which they were composed. And we need to ask ourselves about that context. The commentaries are likely to tell us more about that particular context rather than about the text itself, even as they will obviously throw light on what might for us be difficult terms or terms with which we are no longer familiar. So I think that it works as a two-way process, but perhaps more valuable for the period of the commentary than for an insight into the text, if one is looking at it from a historical point of view.
There's another
So
question.
there are two questions from the first question. These are from Sanjeevani Nanda. So the first question to you, Professor Roy, is that what should be kept in mind while using Arthashastra as a source to reconstruct the early historic period of India? And the second question she asks once more to you is that what is the political historical relevance of the Mandal theory of Arthashastra?
I think in terms of what needs to be kept in mind, we've probably looked at many of these. Thank you. We've looked at these issues in the course of the discussion. No matter what, whether we're looking at the Arthashastra or any other mind, to keep in mind the intended audience, and then to look at the text from that point of view, from that perspective. Apart from looking at the provisions, and as I was saying, one of the things which you have with any text which is slightly complex is that you can distinguish between what text is taking for granted, which gives us a certain understanding of that period, serves as the ideal. Because again, when you have an ideal, then that partly suggests that those ideals are probably not being taken for granted. They don't exist in society, therefore somebody has to lay down those norms. And also to give us an idea about what is being regarded as central from the point of view of the authors of the text. So I think these are 2 or 3 simple, basic strategies to keep in mind, no matter what the text we are looking at. Also to look at it in terms of the kind of language being used, and to remember that every language has several registers. So for instance, the Puranas that Kunalda was referring to are written in a Sanskrit that we could probably all of us understand if we listen to it slowly and carefully. There is a lot about it which we would be familiar with. Whereas if we look at a sutra of the Arthashastra, and if we do not have the context for that, it might seem far more complicated and incomprehensible. So to keep in mind issues of the language, the circulation, all of these are important when we look at it. Turning to the Mandala theory, again, this comes up much more centrally in what I roughly defined as being the second half of the text. And it may, as we were discussing, there are several strata probably within the text, and it may have been of applicability in that particular context, not so much probably in the early historic, but perhaps it is relating to a slightly later period and a slightly different situation.
Ma'am,
There is another question from Sumanto Maiti. This is to you once more. It's about the dates of Arthashastra and how much it is authentic to use it as a source for the Maurya period.
Again, we did have a discussion on the dating. It's useful to remember that some parts are certainly relate to probably to the Mauryan period, if not slightly earlier also. So that is a possibility that is there. Certainly book 2 that we were looking at today seems to be very much related to the Mauryan period. And there have been several studies that have looked at the evidence of the Ashokan inscriptions and compared those with the Arthashastra. So I think what is important for us is not to assign the entire text to a single period, but to look at the different layers and see which might apply to the Mauryan period and which may not. And as we were just discussing, for example, if you look at the evidence about coinage, it's interesting that throughout the text, you do not have any reference to the use of gold coins, although you do have references to the use of coins. So it's a world where money exists, but it is not one where you have the prevalence of gold coins. So that does give us a kind of indicator of where one would place past sections of the text probably.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, question for Professor Chakraborty. Sir, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are. Yes, I can hear you.
Could you please elaborate a bit on the reception of Bengal Puranas by the ruling class in Bengal, who were non-Brahmins?
You see, the Bengal Puranas were written over a long period of time. The previous question actually was on the dating of the Arthashastra and whether we can try and correlate the data derived from the Arthashastra to that of the history of the Mauryan period. Now, the dating of the Puranas is once again an extremely, it will be either read out or explicated. You know, the Brata Katha is one example, and there were these professional narrators, the Kathakas, who would sort of take it upon themselves to do it for a fee, right? That was their profession. So they would do it, and these through repeated assertion of a particular point of view. And remember that a Brahminical point of view is not a single point of view. There were many internal differences, but when they were into a territory which was not their own, they were migrant people from outside. And therefore, when they were writing this, they projected themselves as a united front, glossing over their differences. Okay? And so through the repeated assertion of a particular point of view, they were imperceptibly creating a cultural condition whereby people were not always completely consciously imbibing certain features. For example, the Palas, forget that they were not Brahmanas, but they were not even patrons of, particularly the early Pala rulers, were not even patrons of Brahmanism. The patrons of Buddhism. But you have the inscriptions of the early Pala rulers who say that they have taken it upon themselves the responsibility to ensure that each Varna Jati group keep to their respective profession and, within the constraints set by the Varna Jati definitions. That's very, very curious. So obviously, while they were not accepting the Brahminical prescriptions to every little detail, but at least in the matters of social formation, they were certainly imbibing it, and they had so internalized this message that the king is the most significant authority who should keep this social order in place, that they actually assert that statement in their inscriptions. So this will give you an idea of the degree to which these messages were imbibed, internalized, etc. They were, of course, variously enacted. right? And it's not as if that there was a direct connection, although the Puranas keep on saying this, and many other Brahmanical texts keep on repeating this, that the kings must follow the wise advice of the Brahmanas. But it's not as if that they always did so. But in certain fundamental aspects, such as the Brahmanical social formation, the Varna Jati, social formation, even not merely the non-Brahmanic kings, but even non-Brahmanical kings who didn't consider Brahmanism to be the ideology which they personally professed, despite that, they would accept it. And therefore, it was sort of variously understood, variously imbibed, internalized, and then acted upon. That would be roughly the response to your question.
Thank you, sir. There's another question from Antaripa Mondol. She questions how far the Sanskrit texts were successful in disseminating the Brahmanical principles amongst the people not familiar with the language.
That is a question with which I was confronted when I started working on these texts from the very beginning. This was puzzling. I mean, they were trying to negotiate with the local people, taking on indigenous cultural forms, local myths and legends and so on, reworking on them, creating a package, and then offering it to the local people. How this entire process of negotiation be conducted in a language which was not merely not known to the local people, but they were denied access to this language, right? They were not supposed to learn Sanskrit, okay? In which case, what was the point? Now, the point, it seemed to me, was that in order that the texts acquire a status of authority and authenticity, these texts had to be written in Sanskrit. If they were written in the local language, then of course they wouldn't have carried the authority that the Puranas to an extent did. Also remember that the Brahmanical precepts were definitely contained in the Puranas, but the social precepts which were prescribed specifically for the local people to follow, who come under the Brahmanical sphere of influence, were the local Smriti texts. That is to say, the local Dharmashastra texts. And there were several. Actually, there were major Dharmashastra authors for Bengal, culminating in the major figure of Raghunandana, that the name I assume you will be familiar with, and so on. And that was much later, much later, right, than the last date for the composition of the Puranas. So these were once again related phenomenon, but not identical. We should keep in mind. But so far as the transmission of these texts, and that's where the importance of the vratas come in. These indigenous local vratas were mostly meant to be performed by women. And this was an entirely indigenous tradition which was taken over by the Brahmanas. And, the numbers were inflated. This is just to give you an idea of the degree to which the inflation occurred. In the history of Dharma Shastra by P.V. Kane, in one volume, simply the names of the vratas that were listed from the Puranas, the Smritis, and the various commentaries. The Puranas, by the way, did not attract many commentaries because the Puranas were written and rewritten over a period of time, and therefore commentaries was not to that extent necessary. But the Smritis had commentaries, and also some bhashyas of the Puranas, and so on. He collected all of these names and put them one after the other as a list, and it covered roughly 150 pages. This will give you an idea. Obviously, this is unworkable. Nobody could have performed all those vratas together. or else people would have done nothing else, right? But they were just trying to create as many occasions as possible for as many people to organize the performance of these vratas, and where sort of keeping a vigil at night and listening to the recitation of the Puranas was mandatory. Now, the Kathaks, and I have been privy to some of the Kathak performances in my childhood and adolescence. I mean, it's becoming an almost extinct art, but even in the 19th and up to the mid 20th century, there were professional Kathaks, and on occasions they would be invited by a locality, by even let's say a landowning family and so on. Gaganendranath Thakur, for example, when he lost one of his sons, in order to forget the bereavement for himself as well as his family, he had organized the performance of Kathakatha in the Tagore house, which lasted for a month, and so on. This is just to give you an example. So I've seen them. So these Kathaks would from time to time quote certain Sanskrit verses, shlokas, but they would speak in Bangla, and they were extremely proficient people. Not merely that they knew these texts inside out, but they also had a very live eye for the audience and their requirements. And according to their perception of the requirements of the audience, they would make changes, right? Reformulate it and so on. The emphasis would vary from one of such performance to the other and so on, and they offer a package, as it were, to the people. So this was done in the vernacular, and the importance of the vernacular can be seen in even the language of these texts. For example, R.C. Hajra, the great Sanskritist Rajendra Chandra Hajra, who's done extensive work on the Puranas, writes that the Devi Purana, which was Bengal Upapuran, the Devi Puran was written in a language. I'm just giving you an example. And this is also partly Hajra's method, how he localized these texts. None of these texts say that this is being written in Bengal. So the Sanskritists and historians have to infer from certain indications, certain lakshanas in the text themselves, on the basis of which they are able to identify. He says for the Devi Purana that the Sanskrit language was so completely corrupted by the local vernacular language that there were umpteen number of errors in the grammatical forms of Sanskrit, the Sanskrit in which the Devi Purana was composed. And R.C. Hajra had actually listed the categories of grammatical errors in this text, excuse me, in these texts, over 174 pages. This will give you an idea. Now, this hybrid Sanskrit is not new. This is not, it doesn't pertain only to Bengal, right? Other places also, it has happened. The vernacular was indeed important, and there were adjustments, conscious ones and unconscious ones. For example, these errors were not consciously imbibed. They just crept in. Okay, and as I said, the hybrid Sanskrit is not altogether unknown. There were texts like the Lalita Vistar, which were much earlier than the Puranic texts, some of the Bengal Puranic texts, and so on. And so we know about it. So the primary medium of dissemination must have been vernacular. No doubt about that. But we don't really know the extent to which this was successful or possible or etc. For example, I looked at the number of manuscripts of the Bengal Puranas that have been discovered so far and are located in different parts of undivided Bengal, that is the present West Bengal and Bangladesh, right? And these are fairly extensive and numerous. This will give you an indication that it's not as if that there was a core Brahminical territory in Bengal from which it was disseminated. No, I mean, there are a very large number of such texts which have been discovered from the easternmost part of the present Bangladesh, such as Srihatta and Chattogram, right? Sylhet and Chittagong. So the texts were fairly well disseminated. And why were these texts necessary? Because the Kathakas would have to train themselves with reference to these texts and so on. So it's a very, very valid question. It still remains to a large extent unresolved in my mind. But this is a question that I have always asked, and that's why I think that in creating cultural forms, the process of dissemination is so important. I mean, for example, take the example of the Ashokan inscriptions. Before that, we don't have examples of written Brahmi and so on. For the first time, these texts were created and then put in different areas. And if local people who couldn't read the script, what was the point of, if public instruction was one of the major reasons why these edicts were created and, put in areas, such as trade routes and crossroads and so on, so that people can notice them. What's the point of noticing, this stone pillar or what have you, if they couldn't read it? And this is a question that I put before Professor Thapar, who in response to my question actually wrote an essay saying what would be the manner in which the contents of the Ashokan edicts would be disseminated. I mean, for example, she suggests on the basis of evidence that they were trained professional readers of these texts who would read and explain the contents of it to the people, right? And so on. So the process of dissemination is a very, very major one. Keep that in mind.
Kunal, actually, we're running short of time.
Okay.
No, we'll take only two questions. And I went through the questions that have been posted here, and I find that, two of the questions are important, really. One is by Sharadindu Shahu, and this is, he asks, what was the reaction of local inhabitants of Bengal against the Brahminical aggression? And were they easily assimilated with the culture of Brahmanas, or was there contestation? This is one. And the other question, which is also, I think, important, is by Turni Bishwash. She asks, do we have any knowledge of the response of the Buddhist Sanghas in Bengal as they were being otherized and pushed out from the social milieu of Bengal? So,
both definitely very important questions. Yes, indeed, they were contested. I mean, I was saying so in my paper, and that is one of the fundamental points. Reading the Puranas, it may appear a superficial reading. That's why deep reading is necessary. Right? From a superficial reading, it would appear as if that they were dictating terms. No question. For example, if you keep your eyes and ears and your mind open to the discomfort of the Brahmanas about accepting the goddess itself, would give you an idea of the extent to which they were being dictated by the local cultural forms, indigenous local cultural forms. And they had to accept it against, it would appear, against their better judgment. For example, Tantra, I'm not getting into this question because it's a very large and a very intricate one, but the Tantras, for example, okay, right, they did accept part of it. The Bengal Puranas, all the mantras are not Vedic mantras. The mantras through which these goddesses have to be appreciated, including Lakshmi, are tantric mantras. Okay, but they therefore had to accept the overwhelming presence of tantric forms of worship and sadhana. But
I
they
think has lost his
attempted to
connection.
create. You've lost the connection? Shall I switch off?
No, Kunalda, we can hear you. We can please
all right.
continue.
Okay. So as I was saying, that they created an artificial distinction between the right-handed tantra and the left-handed tantra, the Bhamachara. Okay, the Dakshina Tantra and the Bhamachara. And they said that the Bhamachara, which had sort of more outlandish kinds of rituals, were unacceptable to Brahmanism, but the Dakshinachara was actually in consonance with Brahmanism. Nothing of that kind. This is simply an assertion. Tantra and Brahmanism cannot go together. This is a huge concession to the locally known prevailing forms of worship, etc. So it was hugely contested. There's no question about it. But one has to be sensitive to this. You see, what was the reaction of the local people? We don't know. The local reaction, or we have to speculate on the possible reaction of the local people from the Brahminical literary productions themselves. It's a difficult task, but it is entirely possible. That's a matter of method, and one has to sort of, look into it carefully, read through the superficial assertions, and get into. And I just gave Nupur already said that we are running late for time, and therefore I cannot elaborate on it. But this is a very, very, very major issue.
Kunalda, you can. Actually, I picked up those two questions because I thought out of all, these are the ones which really require your answer.
Right.
And the rest of are actually specific questions. So
Okay. So let me give you, as I said, that even after the end of the composition, the very last kind of redactions to these texts by about 13th, at the most 14th centuries, these texts had to be closed. There's a certain closure to these texts. You see, why write many Puranas? Write one continuous text that carries on over a long period of time? No, there has to be some kind of a closure to a text, and a new text carrying on with the same kind of material and so on will have to be created, right? I mean, I for example, I was the other day reading a 17th century text, a Bangla text, in which it says that in order towards the very end, that in order to elucidate this matter, we'll have to go into this. However, that's not the matter for these texts. For that, another texts have to be written. The book ends with that, এর জন্য আলাদা কিতাব হয়. This kitab ends here. This book ends here. A new text will have to be composed for in order to deal with this matter, and so on. But even after the completion of these Puranic texts, not one, all the texts, we still have the same process of cultural negotiation carrying on. And if you were looking for the textual sites for these negotiations, these are mostly Mangalakabha texts. You see, in the Puranas, the goddesses are mostly the various versions of Parvati, Durga, some Kali, etc., Radha, and so on. Major Brahmanical goddesses. There are references in the Brahma-vaivarta Puran and in the Devi Bhagavata Puran to a few of the local or at least regional goddesses, such as Manasa, such as a particular variety of Chandi, which is common to Bengal, right? Mangala Chandi is the name, and Shoshti, etc. Now, correct genealogies have been created for them. Somebody is the wife of the Devasena Kartikeya, somebody is the daughter of Shiva, etc. But these are just references. Now, from about the 15th, 16th centuries, you begin to have multiple texts containing the same kind of signifier, that is Manushamangal, written by 10 different poets or more. Similarly, Chandimangal and so on. These Mangala Kavyas carry on with the process of negotiations more at the grassroots level than the Puranas could allow themselves to come down to. Okay? Therefore, we have to keep this distinction in mind, that the process of cultural negotiation didn't end. It hasn't ended now, right? It is a story of negotiation, of contestation, and then attempting to create a hegemony, right? That's domination of a particular kind. Okay, so it's not as if that even though we do not have the version produced by the local people as a reaction to the Brahminical package which was being offered to them, but it's not all that difficult to gauge if we have a longue durée history of this process in mind, where you have a post-Purana vernacular text. Remember that even these texts are written by Brahmanas. All the Mangalakava texts are written by Brahmanas. Nevertheless, just as the Puranas were written by Brahmanas, and there are enough indications that they are conceding, they're making major concessions. Similarly, the vernacular texts and so on, you have to keep yourself open to that, right? So indeed, these were very seriously contested. The interesting history is not of the creation of Brahminical hegemony. The interesting history is the history of the contestations. Okay? Yeah, Nupur, I'm sorry, I missed out on the other question. That is,
Yeah, the other question is about Buddhist Sanghas. Yes.
Well, we do not really have much Buddhist reaction, not definitely for Bengal. Of course, we know that across India, when Brahmanism was challenging Buddhism, the Buddhists responded in various ways. In fact, the Brahmanas responded to Buddhism in various ways, including the writing of the Puranas. One of the major threats to the creation of the Brahminical hegemony was the overwhelming presence of the Buddhists, the Jains in pockets, and so on. Right? Definitely. So a good deal of Brahminical productions was in response to the Buddhists, and the Buddhists were responding to the Brahmanas, so that this dialogical process goes on. Unlike the local people who were unable to produce their texts, the Buddhists, of course, were doing, and there are so many examples of public debates between the Buddhist philosophers and the Brahminical philosophers, and Brahminical philosophies were to a very large extent created in response to and governed by Buddhist philosophies and vice versa. So this was a two-way dialogical process. For Bengal, you see, there was a problem. The Bengal Buddhists were so deeply imbricated by the Tantras that, this is a major argument that I make, is that the differences between the Brahminical adoption of the goddess and the Buddhist adoption of the goddess was sort of getting obliterated. There were, of course, very fine theological distinctions, and these are sort of debated over and over, not necessarily in the Puranas. Although, as Kumkum said, and rightly, that the Puranic Sanskrit is far easier to understand than, let's say, Arthashastra or the Sutra texts. But there are passages which are extremely difficult to follow, where the Puranas are attempting to contend with Advaita philosophy. Okay, be extremely difficult. And there was this eminent Sanskritist, Professor Meenakshi, in our department in JNU. And when I occasionally consulted her with passages which were so difficult for me to follow. That one day she said that, Kunal, I had no idea that the Puranas contained such difficult passages too. But by and large, the narrative sections are much easier understood. Anyway, so there was continuously that, but I was arguing that as a result of the pervasive presence of Tantra, both in Buddhism and in Brahmanism, right, the subtle theoretical differences between them were getting obliterated in the eyes of the laity. For example, the Tantric Buddhist Tara and the Tantric Brahmanical Tara, an uninitiated layperson, how can he or she make any difference? Okay, so it's not as if that Buddhism as a very well-defined institutional identity was reacting to the Brahmanical incursions towards the end by a very solid support from the state. We don't have that kind of information for Bengal. But then the texts such as the Charyapadas, the Charyacharya Vinishchaya, and so on, and there are other texts where we see the interaction. These are Buddhist texts primarily, right? But the interaction of some sorts. But we don't have institutional reaction of Buddhists, which could easily have been there had it not been for this pervasive presence of Tantra, which were beginning to obliterate differences between them. That's my reading.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the two speakers. Now we will go for a 10-minute break. We'll come back after the break.
Okay, thank you for your patience.
Well, that was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that everybody enjoyed it here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we now go for a brief break.
Yeah.
I request Dr. Vishwanathan to take over. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my presentation and hopefully that will go fine. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Just tell me when you are.
Yes, ma'am, but it's not full screen.
Now?
Yeah, it's perfectly audible.
Saying the historian and episodic courses.
Okay, brilliant, fine. So good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. As I mentioned to Professor Dasgupta when she and her colleagues invited me, that while I am someone who often works with epigraphic sources, I am primarily a historian and someone who looks at social and economic history. So hence the title of my my talk today. And the central question that I thought I would just talk about today is, how does a historian make sense of inscriptions? And I thought I would take off from this this lecture by Professor Romila Thapar, which is called Reading History from Inscriptions, where she makes a number of arguments about the Ashokan records and how historians look at them, what are the kinds of questions that they should ask about them, how do we think of audiences, how do we think of patterns of reception, how do we think of ideology, and I thought I could take strength from such an approach, particularly after what was the earlier panel, which was really a masterclass by two of my teachers. So when I was a PhD student at the Center for Historical Studies in JNU, I always had this issue of how in the study of early Indian history, there's sometimes an absence of publicly available conversations on method. So while you can read texts such as, for instance, B.D. Chattopadhyay's The Making of Early Medieval India as a masterclass on, how to look at inscription texts, often these accounts are something that you have to take out from the articles, from the essays. It's not something that is often explicitly spelled out. So it seemed to me that a workshop like this was a very good way to bring together people to talk about sources, about the kinds of issues that we've often had in undertaking our historical research, and what are the kinds of questions that we frame our discussion around. So I thought that was something that would be good to do. And let me begin my discussion with this paragraph from Upinder Singh's recent Honda lecture, where she talks about how over a period of time, historians have now come to understand epigraphic sources. So as she says, the ancient Indian epigraphic world was dynamic and interactive. The epigraphic process included conceptualization, execution, reception, and reaction. Information about the form and content of inscriptions flowed across dynasties and regions, resulting in epigraphic continuities and innovations, and the emergence of pan-Indian patterns of discourse, which allowed for regional variations. Inscriptions were often in conversation with each other, and as in all conversations, it is not only what is said, but what is left unsaid that is important. So I thought this paragraph, puts it really well. Because when we think of how we now understand inscriptional materials, there is this attempt to locate epigraphic materials in terms of both text and archaeology. So as we understand, inscriptions are material texts. And while earlier locations of epigraphy were often in terms of its archaeological context of an inscription in a particular site, or collations based on site-based organization, of late there has been increasing focus on the textual dimensions of epigraphy, on how do we think of the form and content of inscriptions, on epigraphic genre, and how do we read inscriptions as interrelated texts. And this is something that I would like to pick up on in my discussion today. So, as happens in any study, one starts with certain points of departure. And when I was working on my PhD, the standard thing that you do is you do this survey of scholarship that has come before you. And often when you look at the scholarship, it frames either points of reference or points of departure. And when I started looking at the early Brahmi inscriptions, I actually started looking at the inscriptions of Sanchi, inspired by these two articles by Upinder Singh and Kumkum Roy. But when I was in my MPhil, I was handed this volume by Professor Ranveer Chakravarti, this volume of the Uttankita Sanskrit Vidyaranya epigraphs. And I realized that the world of the early Brahmi inscriptions was actually really vast. And that there was a whole set of patterns that hadn't been thought about, and that when one looked at surveys of Indian epigraphy, they often moved very quickly from the Ashokan records to the Gupta record. So this large period in between is something that was often not looked at, or was looked at often in relation only to the Ashokan inscriptions. And it seemed to me important to disaggregate and to try and make sense of these records, not only in terms of site-based understanding, such as, for instance, Luder's Mathura inscriptions, which puts together all the inscriptions from the site of Mathura, a large majority of which come from the early historic period. But you also had exercises such as Luder's list of Brahmi inscriptions, where he puts together all the all the inscriptions that were known in the early 20th century from the early historic period. So it seemed to me that there were two kinds of ways in which inscriptions from this period have been studied. One was, the site-based approach, and the other was this kind of approach, or that's seen in Luder's list, which was to collate these records, right? And I figured that I needed some other way of looking at them. And I did not want a site-based approach, but I also did not want something that was too large and uncontrollable. So the early Brahmi inscriptions have been found, from many regions in the subcontinent. And finally, for me, I think a moment that helped me narrow down my area of research was when I picked up V.V. Mirashi's History and Inscriptions of the Satavahanas and Western Kshatrapas. And I saw that this was a set of inscriptions which, though they were very well known, and that there had been lots of very, fine scholarship on them, still had questions that they were posing to me as a historian, right? That was really the point at which my research took off. And when I started looking at these inscriptions, there were not that many people interested in them. But in the last decade or so, there has been a lot of work on the early Brahmi materials. And in many cases, the advances of digital epigraphic techniques have also been, applied to them. So what I have here is one such example, the early inscriptions of Andhra Desha database, right, which is publicly accessible and shows you the advances that have been made in this kind of representation of epigraphic data. Okay, so that's the general background. The question that I wanted to ask today is really this, that what happens if instead of looking at large corpora, right, these collections of manuscripts, we look at one inscription, and in how many ways can we really read it, okay? So the inscription I want to talk about today is this one, right? This is the estampage of the Nashik inscription of Ushvadatta, dated to the years 42 and 45. As you can see, that doesn't look like very much. But if you look at the text of the inscription edited by D.C. Sarkar in his select inscriptions, you can see, both the text as well as the critical notations below it, right? So this is the inscription I want to talk about today, and a lot of what I'm discussing today is thoughts on the method of reading inscriptions, which I worked out in an article published in 2018 called Ushvadatta's Akshaya Nidhi. So, while this is a summarized presentation, I spell out some of these issues in greater detail in this article. So that's something that I want to think about together. That while we often talk about large sets of data or inscriptions belonging to a particular dynasty or inscriptions coming from one site, as historians, there is a lot actually that can be extracted from a single inscription, provided we are open to different ways of reading it. Right? At the same time, one must emphasize that Ushavadatta's inscription is an exceptional inscription, right? And in part, a lot of what I'm able to say reflects the exceptional nature of this record. In the way that this inscription has often been understood, it's been located, as was being mentioned even yesterday, in a dynastic history, a history of these warring dynasties. So almost every textbook of ancient history will tell you about this famous conflict between the Shakas and the Satavahanas, which is dated to the early centuries CE. We know that we have evidence of the Satavahanas before this period, and where the Shaharata dynasty of the Kshatrapas is concerned, of whom Nahapan is the most famous representative, they kind of rise to par with him, though we know of two of his ancestors, right? But there's a number of these closely related Shaka dynasties in the regions of northwestern India, modern-day Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Now, the inscriptional evidence, of course, has been read in relationship to numismatic evidence, such as these famous counter strikes, right? So that you have these coins of Nahapan, which was subsequently struck over by Gautamiputta Satakani. There's a certain violence to the process, right? If you think of it, it is the reflection of a conflict, but these processes of overstriking, as Professor Boperachi's lecture yesterday showed us, were very common among political regimes of these times. So the inscription that I'm talking about is part of this larger set of inscriptions, which is located at the caves at Pandulina near Nashik, right? And the inscription of Ushavadatta is one of three inscriptions of this ruler, which is found in Vihara 10 at Nashik. And in cave 3, we have the inscriptions of Gautamiputta Satakani and Vasistiputta Pulaman. Now, what is important to note is that although Nahapana is the ruler of the Shaharata Kshatrapas, we have no inscriptions coming from his reign. We have no inscriptions that are his. Okay, what we do have are inscriptions of his son-in-law, Ushavadatta, as well as Ushavadatta's relatives, so his wife Dakkamitta, and there's one inscription of his son. So in a sense, this inscription of Ushavadatta that I want to talk about, while it is often in such scholarly collations associated with Nahapana, is actually something that one has to look at as a particularly individual and localized emplotment of power. Okay, and we know that Nahapan and his armies were subsequently defeated by Gautamiputta Satakani and the Satavahana armies. And in then this cave 3 at Nasik, we have inscriptions commemorating this decisive victory and the defeat also, therefore, of Ushavadatta, who would have been Nahapan's viceroy in the Deccan. Now, of interest, of course, is also this question of the placement of epigraphs, because as I said, if inscriptions are material texts, then we often also have to consider their location. And my reading of the inscription is obviously then located in a large body of archaeological and art historical work which has studied these inscriptions. So this is the estampage, and as you can see, it's a pretty braided record. And if you look at the particular inscription that I'm talking about, it's this one, 2 over here. And as we can see, there's an inscription of a longer inscription of Ushavadatta that's located in this cave, as well as a more damaged inscription that's located here. There are also 2 inscriptions of his wife, Dakkamitta. right? So if you want an image of the inscription, we have over here, this is, we are looking at this inscription, and we're looking at this inscription over okay. So, and it's important also to point out that, the records themselves indicate that they would have existed in a number of forms. So while we study these records as inscriptional texts that were engraved on stone, this inscription of Oshavadatta also tells us that the entire transaction was proclaimed and registered. Etacha sarvasravita nigama sabha nibaddha cha phalakavare charitrato iti. So all of this has been proclaimed and registered at the town hall and registered on tablets according to custom. So what that forces us to recognize, of course, is the fact that these texts, which we're used to looking at in very particular ways, as these texts inscribed with particular choices on stone, would have also existed in other forms, and that there is this larger history of oral proclamation as well as of documentary copies of inscriptions that we perhaps haven't fully been able to reach out to because of the shortage of our materials. Okay, so then if this is the larger context in which one locates this text, obviously we also need closer ways of reading a text, right? So this particular inscription, then I took the decision to compare these two editions of the inscription, one by Emile Senart, published in Epigraphia Indica, and the other by B.V. Mirashi in his compendium of the Satavahana and Western Kshatrapa inscriptions. So in both cases, you have the text and the translation. And I actually found that there were a lot of sometimes significant differences in interpretation between Mirashi and Senhart's translations and interpretations of the text. So these had to then be very carefully compared, and I put together, if you like, a text where I drew upon these great scholars, but I also understood their interpretation of the record in historical terms, right? So if one just looks at how the inscription starts, it starts with a Siddham. We have to remember that the way in which these texts are presented in scholarly work, there are often insertions, right? So the punctuation, for instance, is an insertion. It's not something that exists in the inscription as we have it on the stone surface. So the record starts with a date in the year 42. But what is this year? There has been some debate about. And then it says, Vesakha Mase Rano Shaharatasa Shatrapasa Nahapanasa Jamatra Dinika Putrena Ushavadatena Sanghasa Chatu Desasa Imam Lenam Niyatitam Datta Chanena Akshayanivi Kahapana सहस्राणि त्रीणि संघस्य चातुदेशस्य य इमस्मिन् लेने वसन्तानां भवसति चिवरिक कुषणमूले च. Now for me, this is really the core of the record. What is it that it's saying in the year 42, in the month of Meshach? Ushavadatta, the son of Dinika, the son-in-law of King Nahapan, the Shaharata Kshatrapa, has bestowed this cave on the Buddhist community of the four quarters. He has also given a permanent endowment of 3,000 kahapanas to the Buddhist community of the four quarters to be utilized for the expenses of clothing and other requisites for the bhikkhus living in this cave, right? So unlike the other inscriptions of Ushavadatta, which have these long kind of accounts of his many gifts, here it's one specific transaction, right? And then the inscription goes on to spell out the details of this transaction. So these kahapanas that have been given, they're invested in the guilds at Govardhana, 2,000 in one weaver's guild and 1,000 in another weaver's guild, and these specifications of interest. And then it tells us these kahapanas are not to be repaid, only their interest is to be enjoyed. right? So then there are further details about how, the interest is to be spent. And in addition to these Kahapanas, Ushavadatta also gifts in the village of Chikhalapadra a gift of 8,000 coconut trees, fine? And then there is this proclamation and registration of the transaction, following which there is a section that is written in smaller characters, which Mirashi identifies as an appendix, which talks of an earlier gift, right, that was made in the year 41, as opposed to this gift made in the year 45, which was settled on, Brahmanas. Okay, so as I said, the exercise involved really creating this text based on the interpretations of Senat and Mirashi, with me applying, historical reasoning wherever possible. Okay. Now, here's an inscription. It's a very interesting inscription. It relates to a transaction that we want to think a bit more about. But very quickly, let me also point out the scholars have particularly recently pointed to many questions of language that we need to think about. So here, for instance, is a table from Andrew Olecht's recent history of Prakrit, language of the snakes, where he compares these two other inscriptions of Ushavadatta at Karle and at Nashik. And he shows that, there are these choices being made. In the case of one inscription, which you can see here on the left, it's being written in Prakrit, but in this other inscription, that Prakrit is, really moving towards Sanskrit. It's practically Sanskrit. So there are these choices about language that are being made in these records, right? And the other point that needs to be made is that often there has been a tradition, a scholarly tradition, to take these Prakrit inscriptions and Sanskritize them. So what I have up here is, of course, that exercise from DC Sarkar's Select Inscriptions. And of course, I am by no means, fit to speak on someone of Sarkar's expertise. But the point has been made that, for instance, if you look at this term, Kushanamula, in the text, Sarkar Sanskritizes it to Krishna Mulyam, which he, interprets as, a minor food, but actually, as scholarship has shown, comparing the inscriptions from the Western Deccan with the Kharoshti materials that have been discovered, the term Kushanamula is actually a linguistic variant, a dialectical variant of Kushalamula, which is literally roots of bliss, which is a term that you find in a number of the Kharoshti records, referring to items that were gifted in the exercise of making merit. Okay, so I don't have that much time, but let me just talk of the strategies that were useful in terms of deconstructing this text. So you have the text, you have the translation, but how do you understand it further? How do you break it down? How do you pose questions to it? So, if you look at this record of Ushavadatta, you can see there's several transactions recorded in the space of a single inscription. First of all, Ushavadatta is giving a cave to the Sangha. Then there's an endowment of 3,000 Kahapanas. There's a gift of 8,000 coconut trees, not a small gift. And there's an earlier gift of 7,000 Kahapanas to gods and Brahmanas that has been made. But if you look specifically at this transaction that is called an Akshaya Nivi, that is what he does with these 3,000 Kahapanas, which he gives to the monks of the Buddhist Sangha. He creates a perpetual endowment. The term Akshaya suggests something that is indestructible. Nivi is a deposit. So, some kind of indestructible deposit. And this is often translated as a perpetual endowment. So he sets this up saying, I am giving you 3,000 Kahapanas to set up this perpetual endowment. And then he specifies where the endowment is to be invested according to which conditions in which two guilds. He also spells out the rates of interest accompanying the transaction. And finally, the inscription states that the capital was not to be returned. Apadidatva, and only the interest was to be enjoyed. So the interest is what's here Vadhi, but Sanskrit Vridhi. Now, if you do some basic kind of maths on this, fine, you find that in the first deposit, there are 2,000 kahapanas that are invested at the rate of 1 kahapana per 100 per month. And this works out to 240 kahapanas per year, right? It's a 12% rate of interest. In the second deposit with the second yield, the kahapanas there are 1,000 kahapanas that are invested at the rate of 3/4 kahapana per 100 per month. And what you get is 90 kahapanas per year at a 9% rate of interest calculated annually. Okay, the interest, however, is calculated monthly. This is what you get when you have an annual figure. How do we know that the interest was calculated monthly? It's by comparing, okay, the details that are found in the inscription of Ushavadatta with details that you're getting from other inscriptions in the other caves of the Western Deccan. So here, for instance, is this particular gift made by it's well, not really clear, but the money is to be invested monthly, right, as is clear from the term Mase. Okay, so therefore, then we can see that this record of Ushavadatta records, this extremely interesting economic transaction. This transaction is particularly valuable when we consider that we are looking at these inscriptions in a historical context of early historic urbanism. We know that both the Kshatrapas and the Satavahanas were interested in long distance trade. And you can clearly see that there are these guilds and there is this thriving pattern of commercial activity, which all people, all the participants in the transaction are drawing upon. Now, the fact that Ushavadatta's inscription is part of it's a royal inscription, right? This endowment is not something that's made by just any householder. He is someone who's the viceroy of the king, and it allows us to raise certain questions about the long-term history of such endowments, right? So just because a donation, is said to be a perpetual gift, does it mean that it's actually perpetual? How long would it continue in practice? As long as the guild was in operation, as long as the donor was alive, as long as the capital retained a suitable interest. And this is particularly interesting because, as we know, there is this mortal conflict that then takes place between the forces of Nahapana, Ushavadatta, and the Shaharata armies, and the Satavahana armies on the other side, with Gautamiputra Satakarni eventually being victorious. Right? So, if Ushavadatta has made all these donations, do these donations actually continue? Right? Is it a case where, because this endowment has been placed with the guilds continue to kind of give this return, right? Even after the patron is done and gone. Now, this is not a question that we can really answer, right? But it's a question that we have to ask. And what is also interesting is if you compare the patterns of patronage between these two dynasties, in some cases you're seeing continuity, but in some cases you're seeing change. So Gautamiputra, for instance, continues the gift of a field made by Ushavadatta to the Buddhist Sangha, but we subsequently see that the term Akshayanivi, right, Akshayanivi, which was used in Ushavadatta's inscription to refer to a monetary endowment, is being used as a reference for an kind of gift of land, right? And subsequently, we find actually that you have these increasing numbers of references in the inscriptions of the Western Deccan as well as elsewhere, where Akshayanivi Datta becomes a reference to gifts of land that are made in perpetuity. And this is something that gets incorporated into the formulary of the land grant. So these patterns of change then are something that we need to think about. But for now, let me just stay with Ushavadatta's Akshayanivi. One of the things that this inscription allows us to do, if we read it as a comparative text, is we can compare it with a number of texts of this Buddhist sect of the so what is the canon of the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, right? So a number of those texts are actually now in Tibetan, but through the work of scholars like Gregory Chopin, they are being studied. for what they can tell us about Buddhism in the early historic period. And there is a lot of material on agrarian relationships, commercial transactions, taxation that is coming out from these studies, right? And I will end with this. So we can actually compare Ushuvadatta's record with this, transaction of an Akhayanidi with, this long story that is told in the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, where the story runs that basically these Lichavis are building these buildings collapse. They say, "Oh my God, these these buildings are collapsing. Let us ensure that the patronage that we give to the Sangha is not something that collapses so easily." Right? So they go and they give a certain sum of money to the Buddhist Sangha where the Buddha is still there, and the monks of the Sangha first. They give it to some people who are poor, so they are not able to then eventually return that money. Then the second time they give it to some people who fight amongst each other. Again, that money then is lost. And then finally, when the Lichavis complain, the Buddha lays down this set of prescriptions where he says that any such endowments, right, any such gifts that are made to the Sangha have to be accompanied by this entire process, that one has to take a pledge, we have to of twice the value, there has to be this written contract, the contract has to be witnessed, right, and all these details have to be recorded, right. And what is interesting then is that the text and epigraph are in some ways can be read as two sides of a coin, right? The epigraph tells you all the transactions that took place on the side of the guilds, right? And the donor, while this text tells you how such endowments were handled by the Sangha. So there is a way in which then we can read epigraphic texts, not only in terms of the details that they give us, but also in relation to other texts. And this allowed me to postulate that we could think of the Akhayanidi in the early centuries CE in terms of a tripartite relationship, right? So there is a relationship between the lay donor, the Sangha, and the guild, where the donor gives money to the Sangha, this money is then given to the guild, right? And the guild gives the interest back to the Sangha, and the idea is that the Sangha, through its use of the gift, gives merit to the donor, and that merit is something that is perpetual. So just to sort of summarize what I was trying to do, it's to say basically that there's a whole range of ways in which we can read inscriptional text, and even a singular inscription can be read in ways where there's a whole range of material that we can get out of it. So, my attempt was only to show you something that I did and how I worked it out, and hopefully that's something that you found useful. But the point is that every inscription asks certain questions of us, and it's based on our ability to read it in a whole range of ways that allows us to make sense of these records. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for such an enriching lecture, ma'am. I hope it helped all of us here to broaden our perspectives on epigraphic records as sources of history. Now I warmly welcome our next speaker, Dr. Shayantani Pal of the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta, onto the platform to speak on epigraphy and early Indian source history, metrology, issues and debates. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, your microphone is switched off.
Shantani, please unmute.
Ma'am, you're not audible. You have
Shantani, you have to unmute, yes.
No, ma'am, it's not yet.
Shantani, you have to unmute. Unmute ko niche microphone take.
Okay. Good.
Thank you.
So let me first thank Professor Nupur Dasgupta and Dr. Chandrani Banerjee Mukherjee and the whole faculty of the Department of History, Jadavpur University, for inviting me to this workshop. And today, since this is a session specifically, let me now present my screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes, ma'am, but make it full screen.
Okay.
It is visible, but make it a full. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Shantanu, it's fine.
Okay, thanks. Since this is a session specifically on epigraphic sources, I have decided to talk on methodology, issues, and debates on studying early Indian epigraphic sources. In this lecture, I shall discuss the researches on epigraphic data from a selected region, that is undivided Bengal, from the very beginning. Through this discussion, I shall try to analyze the methodology of studying epigraphs, the issues that have been addressed so far, and what can be done beyond that. To begin with, is the slide moving?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, thanks. So to begin with the methodology of studying Indian epigraphy, there is no denying the fact that the reconstruction of the history of early India has much dependence on epigraphy than on the other category of sources. Thus, epigraphy has been regarded as the backbone of historical construction of early periods. B.D. Chattopadhyay, however, spoke against the fundamentalism, that is conventional approach to different category of sources of early India, as for examples that inscription would be only studied for dynastic shifts, dharma shastras for understanding socio-economic institutions, and philosophical treatise for understanding religion. So this is the conventional approach against which BDC spoke. In the early phase, the focus was obviously on the reconstruction of dynastic history from epigraphic data, and pages after pages have been written on dynastic chronology, political conquests, and relation between dynasties on the basis of epigraphic data. It was the necessity of the period to build up the dynastic chronology in the initial stage, and epigraphy still has a major role in the reconstruction of dynastic history. Recent discoveries of new inscriptions are constantly bringing in changes in the period and the length of the rule of the kings, like the Palas of Bengal and Bihar, who ruled from 8th to the 12th centuries. These again are making changes in dynastic relationships between the contemporary powers, and to some extent, changes in cultural history as well, like the artistic style flourished under particular dynasties or even kings in an area. At a later part of the previous century, it was understood that epigraphic data can be analyzed in groups and that they might illuminate upon interesting aspects, issues, and shifts in the evolution of polity, society, economy, and culture in particular regions, sub-regions, or localities. Scholars thus began to work upon theories put forward from time to time in the history of different parts of the world, like that of the feudal social formation. Counter theories came against it, and thus the researches in epigraphy were no longer limited to the category of historians known as, within quote-unquote, epigraphists, who are experts in language, paleography, and other technical aspects essential for editing the inscriptions, but also to the other practitioners not so efficient in the above technical fields. The importance of the above technical expertise in understanding epigraphic records can, however, hardly be denied. Still, with the coming up of a host of researchers exploring the bulk of epigraphic records of different regions, there was a spurt of writings on the polity, society, economy, religion, and art of different regions. Using the combined method, that is collating the data from epigraphy, literary sources, and archaeological field data, the regional profiles in early Indian history gradually appeared much more clearer. I shall discuss the researches on Bengal epigraphy as a case study for understanding the above statement. The inscriptions of Bengal formed a subject of interest from the early decades of the last century, when under the aegis of the Warendra Research Society, Akshay Kumar Moitra published Gauro Lekhamala and N.G. Majumdar published Inscriptions of Bengal within a gap of 17 years. While the earlier book contained mainly the inscriptions of the Pala dynasty of Bengal and Bihar, the latter contained that of the inscriptions of the Sena, Chandra, and Varman dynasties. In collecting the inscriptions together in a volume, Akshay Kumar Moitra's aim was obviously to write the history of Warendra, or the undivided North Bengal. In his introduction, Maitreyya makes it clear that the inscriptions can speak beyond the rise and fall of the dynasties. They speak about the type of relationship that existed between the state and the subjects, the mechanism of administration, about land and its ownership and transfer, and more importantly, they record stages in the evolution of scripts. Mojumdar, however, was much more precise, and his aim was to prepare mainly a source book for the students of the history of Bengal. He wanted to write within quote unquote scientific documented history from this record, pushing aside the legendary data and to give matter of fact account of the records. So here we get an idea about the comparative value of epigraphic data in the contemporary perspective. By editing and publishing volumes specifically on the inscriptions of Bengal or Eastern India as a whole continued, editing or re-editing newly discovered inscriptions of the country continued in premium journals like Epigraphia Indica or volumes like D.C. Sharkar's monumental work titled Select Inscriptions Bearing on Indian History and Civilization in 2 volumes, Inscriptions of Ancient Assam by Mukunda Madhav Sharma, and so on. Currently, Bengal inscriptions, which are continuously being unearthed in different parts of Bangladesh, West Bengal, and Bihar, are being edited in existing journals like Journal of Bengal Art, Pratna Samikha, Journal of Ancient Indian History, etc. On the whole, there is no dearth of study in early Bengal inscriptions at present, and efficient epigraphists like Ryosuke Furui, Rodot Sannal, Arlo Griffiths are working on the subject. Epigraphic data from a specific area or region can be analyzed by selecting a period like 5th to the 10th or 12th or 13th centuries. Combined with other category of sources, it may enable us in understanding the regional profile and various historical processes like state formation, evolution of language, script, religion, and even art and monetization. For early Bengal, focusing on the works done exclusively on epigraphic data, there are 2 seminal works, one by B.M. Morrison and the other by B. Chattopadhyay. We may begin with B.M. Morrison's seminal study titled Political Centers and Cultural Regions in Early Bengal, published in 1970. It is still considered as an influential work for understanding the early history of Bengal and understanding regional history of early India as well. His noble contribution is the introduction of the concept of subregions in the early history of Bengal, on the basis of 71 land transfer records of the 5th to the 13th centuries. In his view, the entire Bengal Delta cannot be viewed as a single political and cultural entity, as was the practice among the historians prior to him. On the basis of his understanding of the nature of land grants, he classified 4 subregions with their own political centers. This is a map showing the 4 subregions as discussed by Morrison. On the basis of his understanding of the nature of land grants, he classified 4 subregions with their own political centers operating in different periods. Together with this, he also spoke in favor of their separate cultural entity. His concept of subregion has been more or less accepted by the later researchers, although the issue of their distinct cultural entity has been questioned. The emphasis of Morrison was on viewing the land grants simply on the basis of their primary function, that is, as land transfer deeds. Morrison begins his study by discussing the physical appearance, the content, the geographical and historical context of the copperplate charters. He traced variation in the social position of the donors and recipients, kinds of property transferred, whether it's a land plot or whether the whole village is transferred, and reasons for donation, etc. Location of the find spots of inscriptions, location of the lands transferred, and location of the politico-administrative centers in which the grants originated, together with the above analysis of the changing forms of the charters, led to some interesting results. He noticed a 4-fold typology of the charters. They can be situated in 4 political subregions, as you can see in this map, into which the delta was divided. He also suggests that the political history of the delta can be divided into 4 periods, from the time of the Guptas to the coming of the Muslims in the early 13th century. This 4-fold grouping suggests changes in the attitude and organization of the rulers. In the first group, a number of local governments acknowledge the authority of the district and provincial officers who were again appointed by the emperor. The second group of plates belong to a transitional period between the breakdown of the Gupta imperial structure and the organization of the orderly courtly government in the 10th to 12th centuries. The form of political organization were diverse. There were semi-independent local kings like the Khargos or great emperor like Bhaskara Varman. Some of the administrations were hierarchies organized into increasingly larger territorial divisions, while others were like a domestic household expanded to administer the royal domain. The third group of plates, dated from the 10th to the 12th centuries, give less information regarding the court without the graded territorial hierarchy like the Guptas. This royal courtly government again became the pattern and remained until the 13th century. The organization of the government of the fourth group of plates is similar, but their territorial extent was much more confined. The granted lands were situated close to the center of issue. Now, on the basis of the governmental organization and the power of the rulers, Morrison has grouped these four subregions of the Bengal Delta, as you can see in this slide. The first is the Bhagirathi Hooghly area that was always subordinated to other regions, and we get less epigraphic evidence from this subregion. Number 2 is Warendra, which had an urban character according to him. Its administrative unit was Punravardhana Bhukti, with 2 cities, Koti Varsha and Panchanagari, from which land grants were issued. The Guptas and Palas who occupied it did not exercise authority in other parts of the delta. Number 3 is the central part of the delta, through which 3 channels of the 3 major rivers, Ganga, Brahmaputra and Meghna, flowed. And here Bikramapura was a political center. And number 4, the Shamotata, which is characterized by large donation to groups. Here enough surpluses were produced to support large establishments. Besides, the donors had a different attitude to religious institutions. Morrison summarizes his findings by saying that his study shows 2 principal discoveries. First, the extent of 4 political regions in the delta. Second, 4 historically significant periods within 850 years. He ends his study by saying that the study of the sculptural remains of the delta from 9th to 10th century may reveal variation in the proportion of images corresponding to geographic divisions suggested by these copperplate charters, but no such study has been undertaken till this date. There are now some problems with this grouping. We should get back to the map. The position of Srihatta is not clear. Morrison included it within Shamotata due to its orientation towards larger donation, as noticed in the Nidhanpur, the Paschim Bhag, the copperplate, and the grant of Govinda Keshava Devo issued in the 13th century. Besides, we have Horikelo, which had a distinct character, that is the issuance of land grants on vase separated by 3 centuries. We have 2 vase inscriptions from Horikelo, as you know. One was issued, both of them bear the names of kings ending with Deva, but we do not know whether the 2 of them belong to the same dynasty. One is Devati Deva and another is Takara Deva. Now, issue of pure silver coins in which the legend Horikelo occurs also suggests a separate identity of the subregion. Morrison's view of the subregions of early Bengal found support in the writings of later authors who, following his concept of subregions of the Bengal Delta, have carried out further researches on the different historical processes like urbanization. B.D. Chattopadhyay, who studied the urban centers in early Bengal, sought to situate the distribution of the early historic settlement and urban centers, has grouped them under 3 geographical subregions: Warendra, lower delta of the Bhagirathi Hooghly system, and Rado. All this suggests that Morrison's view of subregions influenced the later authors a great deal, although they did not follow it blindly and adopted their own scheme of classifying the Bengal Delta on the basis of their studies. Now, the question is, although political centers at a certain period can be located on the basis of the land grants, how far the cultural character of a sub-region can be understood simply on the basis of land transfer records? They obviously throw light on religious orientation of the rulers and to some extent the people, specifically those who had the ability to donate land. But the identity of a sub-region has much more things to be considered, that its language, art and religious practices, its economic characteristics, the individuality of its society, etc. These are the aspects on which land grants do not help. If we follow any other scale of groupings of sub-regions, we would get different results. As for example, on the basis of coin circulation pattern, B.N. Mukherjee separated 2 currency zones between 550 and 700 CE. First is the Bongo and Gaura Bongo, and the second is the Samodata. if land grants, taking cue from B.D. Chattopadhyay, are to be seen as a legitimizing and integrating device by the emerging regional dynasties, their context becomes clearer. If a certain subregion has orientation towards granting large blocks of land, it is related to its historical context. It could well have been a priesthood area where large scale of tracts, uncultivated or jungle tracts were available, and where cultivators were also available to follow the royal order and give the surplus to the big monastic establishments. Thus, being state documents, the nature of land grant reflects more the orientation of the ruling dynasty or the donor, who might be subordinate rulers or military officers or independent chief, rather than a region or sub-region. Now, the question of the strategy of a particular ruling dynasty would be clear from the instance of the Chandras, who ruled in the eastern part of the delta in the 10th and 11th centuries. They created a wider power base incorporating Samatata, Bongo, and the Sylhet region in the 10th century. Although their seal bears the Buddhist Dharma Chakra, none of their charters record land grant to any Buddhist monastery. Even they do not mention the large monasteries built by the earlier kings like the Khargas and the Devas in Manamoti. The earlier tradition of granting large block of land to collectives persists in the Paschim plate of Sri Chandra. Apart from the Paschim plate, all other donations were made by the kings to individual Brahmanas in the subsequent period. The case of the Paschim charter is different, as it is an early record of the family in Sylhet, Srihatta Mandala, mentioned in the epigraph, which was a newly conquered area to the Chandras. The creation of the Brahmanical settlement ensured control over this distant area from their political center at Bikramapura. The Chandras, the first regional power of southeastern and eastern Bengal, were more enthusiastic to support the Brahmanas, often proficient in conducting sacrificial rituals, than the institutions, whether Buddhist or Brahmanical. Now we turn to another significant work based on epigraphic data, however not exclusively on Bengal inscriptions. We may refer to Professor Brajadulal Chattopadhyay's book titled Aspects of Rural Settlements and Rural Society in Early Medieval India. Now, early Bengal inscriptions are...
One second, Shantini, do you need to change the slide? Because, yes, maybe.
Thank you, Nupurdi. Now, early Bengal inscriptions are replete with reference to village, its different parts known like the Vastu or homestead land, the Kshetra or cultivable land, the Gochara or the pasture land, the Pallis, the Patakas referring to parts lying within it, and above all, the village boundaries, since the inscriptions in which these are found are records of transfer of tax-free land, and thus their boundaries and locations needed to be specified. Now, this reflects how epigraphy, the discussion by BDC reflects how epigraphy can become a tool for understanding the dynamics of the rural settlement and societies of early India, especially when they were labeled as monolithic, stagnant, closed, and changeless by different theorists from time to time. In this study, B.D. Chattopadhyay has extensively used the inscriptions to understand the settlement pattern, society, different social groups, and the dynamics of the relationship within and outside the villages that existed in varied landscapes in early medieval India, like undivided Bengal, Rajasthan, and southern Karnataka. How spatial characteristics of settlement, like the location of Vastu, Kshetra, Gochara, and further the concentration of people following the same occupation, shape of the village society, was one important and less discussed theme upon which he concentrated in this study. He extensively used the boundary descriptions given in land grant charters while specifying the location of the granted plots of land. One point he highlighted upon was that the change in name of a certain space over time reflected in inscriptions of the same area but of different time may indicate the change of the character of the settlement and resulting changes that could happen. As for example, from the Chahamana inscriptions, he refers to the change of name of a settlement from Bhillamalo, which suggests a territory or a settlement inhabited by the Bhillas, the Bhil tribe, to Srimala in the Chahamala inscriptions. Often we find a group of villages coming together forming a unit called Vithi in Bengal charters of the 5th, 6th century, and the prominent families appearing in an official body called Gram Ashtakuladhikarana or simply Ashtakuladhikarana to take decisions regarding sale of land in the locality. Among such prominent members were the Mahottaras or the village elders, The Kutumbins, this has been translated as peasant householders, but Arlo Griffiths, who recently edited 4 copperplate charters of the Gupta period, prefers the translation as landholder, and the Brahmanas as well. It has been observed that both in South Karnataka and in Bengal, at an earlier stage, the Brahmanas did not exercise the authority and control over the rural society like the later period. Rather, the Kutumbins and the Mahottaras are often addressed as foremost together with the Brahmanas in land grant records. They even included the Brahmanas, which I will show you later in a slide. The ascendancy of the Brahmanas coincided with the establishment of Agrahara in the Agrahara villages in the later period. Yesterday in his lecture, Dr. Rajat Sharnal has very wonderfully shown the usefulness of looking at the context of epigraphic records by visiting the site and collating epigraphic and field data in order to understand the spatial orientation of early medieval settlements. In an earlier paper, he had pointed out that due to the bewildering continuity over more than a millennium that the rural landscape of Bengal offers, most of the place names mentioned in inscriptions can be identified with their modern counterparts. Thus, one can locate the site of an ancient village settlement by combining inscriptional and field data, as he has done in the case of village of Budhavara mentioned in a Pala copperplate. But still, if we are to depend exclusively on epigraphic data, the study of B.D. Chattopadhyay points to the occasions in which representatives from several villages in an area came together to take decision on the transfer of land in the locality, the hierarchy that existed within the rural space, that is the hierarchy between the Mahottaras, the Kutumbins, and the Brahmanas, and so on. This again indicates that the early medieval villages were not isolates in the rural landscape, and it therefore goes against the theory that claimed that villages were isolated and self-sufficient in early India. I shall conclude my talk by referring to one of my recent study on a single village. As you can see in the slide, the name of the village is Gulmagandhika. This appears in 2 land grant charters within the gap of 8 years, as you can see in this slide. One is dated to the Gupta era 120 and another is dated in the Gupta era 128, and the same village Gulmagandhika and or Gulmagandhika appear in both of the charters. Now, as you can see in this slide, what are the establishments within the village mentioned in these 2 charters? The village contained, as is appears from the Jagadishpur plate, a little peripheral monastery which is called Pranta Viharika, commissioned for the purpose of worshipping the Arhats at Gulmagandhika, which suggests the Jaina affiliation. A Devakula for worshipping Sahasra Rashmi. Sahasra Rashmi is the sun god. And again a Vihara for the venerable Arhats in the shrine of Pechi Kamra Siddhi, or there is a different reading by D.C. Shakar, Mechi Kamra Siddhayatana, in the Dakshinangstaka division of the Vithi, but it was perhaps not within the said village, so I have put this in the bracket. So these are the establishments within the village of Gulmagandhika. Now, what was the status of Gulmagandhika amongst the other villages within the locality? In the Kalaikuri Sultanpur copperplate, we find that Ayuktaka Achyutadasha and his Adhikarano at Purna Koshika of Sringavara Vithi addresses 4 villages. There are some difference of opinion between Arlo Griffiths and D.C. Sharkar regarding the name of the villages, but 4 villages were addressed. In the Jagadishpur charter, 2 of the above villages, namely Gulmagandhika and Sangohalika, are the places of transfer of land. Here the same Ayuktaka Achyutadasa appears, so there is a continuity of his office throughout a period of 8 years. The residents of the village mentioned in the charters. The residents of the Vithi in general have been addressed in the charters, and they formed a group that wished to donate land to Brahmanas and religious establishments. The village must have contained these categories of residents, although it is not mentioned exclusively. In the Kalaikuri Sultanpur charter, the people who are addressed are the Grama Kutumbins, headed by the Brahmanas and others. And in the Jagadishpur charter, the Pradhana Kutumbins, headed by the Brahmanas of the villages, are addressed. So in both cases, the Kutumbins have been addressed. Now, this slide shows the group of donors. As I have already mentioned that in the Kalaikuri Sultanpur, the donors appear in a group. So who are in this group? First, it is headed by a Kulika, which means the artisan. His name is Bhima. Second, there are some Kayasthas. There are 7 Kayasthas altogether. Then there are 7 Bithi Mahottaras, and there are several Kutumbins who appear as donor in this charter. I would like to just point to their names Some of them contained Sharman, and also Swami name endings, which has been regarded by scholars as Brahmana. So it is to be noted that the Kutumbins also included the Brahmanas. Now in the Jagadishpur plate, these are the donors. There are two donors, Bhoilo and Mohidaso. They resided at Gulmagandika, the village under consideration, and they wish to make a donation of 1 kulabapa of land together with Kutumbin Kshemako of Mulagobastako of Punravardhana to 3 establishments. Now here we also find the 4 Bithi Mahottaras and Kutumbins, but they're lesser in number in this copper plate. Now this slide shows the boundary description of the plots and position of the Gulmagandika therein. Land were given, distributed in several plots located in different villages. This is the distribution of plot in the Jagadishpur copper plate. Now it appears that the Bithi, including the village, had more inhabitants desirous of supporting Brahmanas rather than the establishments, which included 2 Jaina and 1 Brahmanical establishment. Besides, persons who are Bithi Mahottaras in the Kalaipuri Sultanpur plate appear as only Kutumbins in the Jagadishpur plate issued 8 years later. Probably they failed to get re-elected in the Adhikarana of the Bithi level at the later occasion. B.D. Chattopadhyay, however, thinks that the Bithi Adhikarana was not a formal elective rural body with a fixed number of rural representatives. The reason that the number of representatives decreased in the later occasion might have been due to the fact that such Bithi Adhikaranas were not formal bodies with a fixed number of representatives. Now I shall conclude my lecture with the following observation. This initial attempt to reconstruct the profile of a village from its description in the land transfer record of the 5th century North Bengal was inspired by Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay's work on the village of Kalikatti in South Karnataka. But there he found 10 records, but here the number of records are limited to 2. Still, what limited data we can find, we can try to analyze that. Gulmagandika was a well-connected village and figured amongst a group of other villages and localities under the jurisdiction of a Bithi or group of villages. Its resident landholding group included the Mahottaras and Kutumbins, that included the Brahmanas too. It has been observed that in this period in North Bengal, the Brahmanas did not form a cohesional and exclusive Varna as they clustered together with other landholders of the locality. The village contained a peripheral monastery for the Jaina Arhats and a temple of Sahasrarashmi, the sun god, located at Sambapura within the village. The main monastery was not within the village and it was to the southern part of the Bithi, as I have already shown in the slide. This again indicates the type of influence that these Jaina establishments could exert upon the residents of the locality. In a Bithi level, we again notice a general concern for both Brahmanical and Jaina establishments from the villagers of Gulmagandika. The village had a root which appears to be old and original. It is called Adyapatha, and it is surrounded by to its west and to its north it had a river called the Vata river. D.C. Sarkar identified that river. To its east there was a Porikha or moat. Thus water bodies were abundant and served as important landmark demarcating the village in the rural landscape. Now to conclude this talk, I have so far tried to highlight what epigraphic data can offer us. Obviously, it is necessary to correlate different categories of sources while writing history, but can we deny that what epigraphic data can offer us is not to be found in other category of sources? The history of the rural settlements, the spatial distribution of the habitable, cultivable, and other types of land, the social groups of the orbit within which they operated, whether it was limited within the village or went beyond it. Such data can only be obtained through an intense analysis of the epigraphs of a certain time and space. So this is the end of my lecture, and thank you for a patient hearing.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the extremely insightful lecture. Our next speaker is Dr. Devkumar Jha of the Department of History, Azim Premji University. He will speak on the topic, Multifarious Facets of Inscriptions Beyond Dynasty Chronicling. I warmly welcome Dr. Jha and request him to take over the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for having me here on this panel on epigraphy. Now, some of my points may overlap with the previous speaker Shayantanidhi, I will try to avoid as much as possible. Now, I will start with some basic importance of inscriptions, and then mainly I will be focusing on 3 points: the beginning and development of epigraphical studies, then the researches based on epigraphic studies, whatever has done so far, and also I will point out in the last section some new trends. So I'll start with the introductions, where I'm talking about some basic importance of epigraphic documents, which have generally been considered as the most reliable one, as they are often contemporary to the period they talk about. Unlike textual sources, they have not been subjected to interpolations. Moreover, epigraphs are firmly datable documents, which is not the case with the other kinds of sources. Not only do epigraphs often carry information on eras and regnal years, but even undated epigraphs can paleo be assigned to a period. Also, their provenance is most of the time help us to demarcate the area under the control of the issuing authority. This is an added advantage of using it as a tool for understanding early India's past. It should also be mentioned here that more than 1 lakh inscriptions have been recovered throughout the subcontinent. The number is increasing. It should also be noted among this, according to an estimate of Noboru Karashima, more than 59,000 inscriptions belong to South India alone. Now I'll be talking about the first sections, where the name of these sections I have given it as History of Epigraphic Studies, where I'll be talking about the beginning and development. In Oriental and utilitarian historiography, early India was seen through the lens of normative and philosophical treatises, where much paid attention on the Shastric norms, presented early India as a land of philosopher, only excelling in spiritual and mystic thoughts, lacking in political or material speculation. However, with the discovery of old inscriptions and other archaeological artifacts from several sites, the scenario started changing rapidly from the 19th century onwards. The lithic documents, visual representations of architectural, sculptural remains, and numismatic specimens gradually attracted the attention of historians. Scholars found interest in deciphering unknown scripts after the foundation of Asiatic Society in Kolkata in 1784. The first decipherment of an old script was made by Charles Wilkins in 1785. Wilkins read the Badal Pillar inscriptions of the Pala king Narayan Pala. In the following years, some more inscriptions were recovered and interpreted, but we had to wait for a few decades more until the spectacular decipherment of Brahmi and Korosti of the Ashokan records by James Prinsep in 1837, based on bilingual coins. He also prepared a chart of the Brahmi alphabet entitled Modifications of the Sanskrit Alphabet from 543 BC to AD 1200. The establishment of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1861 added further momentum to the study of epigraphy because of its inclusions within the domain of archaeology. The ASI started publishing a series of corpus inscriptionum indicarum from 1877, with a particular focus on providing the original text of the inscriptions, along with the translations and editorial comments, followed by the photographs of the record, focusing on a particular dynasty. Thus came out the inscriptions of Ashoka, Guptas, Bakatakas, Silaharas, Kalachuris, Chedis, and other minor dynasties in each separate volume. B. Lewis Rice's Gazetteer of Mysore and Coorg, 1879, and Epigraphia Carnatica, 1886, starting point, are important works on the epigraphic practices of Karnataka. South Indian inscriptions beginning in 1890 is also regarded as a major study on South Indian epigraphs. However, a major boom in this field came with the publication of the Epigraphia Indica series from 1892 onwards. This journal carries detailed discussion on inscriptions with an introductory note mentioning their provenance, story of their recovery, dates, script, and language, along with their text, translation, historical importance, and illustrations. Besides these journals, several monographs on the subject were also published, and we have A.C. Burnell's Elements of South Indian Paleography, G.H. Oja's Prachin Lipimala in Hindi. Bueller's Indian Paleography may be cited also in this context. Gradually, the subject as well as the term Indian epigraphy became so popular that 3 books came under the same title in different time periods, where first by D.C. Sirkar in 1965, followed by K.V. Ramesh in 1984, and finally Richard Salomon 1998. A significant development in epigraphic studies was the creation of a separate epigraphist post by the government of Madras Presidency in 1886, with E. Hulse as its first appointee. The Office of Epigraphist to Government of Madras published annual reports on the epigraphical survey with the summary, comments, and historical significance of the inscriptions. The annual report was called Madras Epigraphical Report and was published in between 1887 to 1921. After that, it came to be known as Annual Report on South Indian Epigraphy, and finally Annual Report on Indian Epigraphy from 1945 onwards. There is often a tendency of placing British scholarship over German scholarship. It should be mentioned in this context that the British historians mostly often viewed the Indian state society from the view of ruling elites, that of a social superior to the so-called who ruled over the so-called uncivilized colonies. But the Germans did not harbor such kind of preconceived notion of presenting early India's past in a specific way to show it as a less qualified from the Westerners. It is for this reason that their perception of Indic documents and past is more reliable and reflects a more rational analysis of the sources. The importance of German scholarship in studying the literary texts, particularly the editing and translation of Vedic text by Max Muller, is well known. But the enormous importance of German scholars such as Bühler, Kilhorn, Fleet, Burgess, Leuders, and others who produced voluminous works in the field of Indian epigraphy do not receive that much attention as the literary genre did. In this context, Ranabir Chakraborty rightly points out that their Germans' stellar role in the epigraphic studies is a major facet of early Indian historiography that needs deeper probing, unquote. Here one should also remember the painstaking efforts of 20th century Indian epigraphists. Most notable among these researchers are G.H. Oja, H. Krishnasastri, R.D. Banerjee, D.R. Bhandarkar, and later on also N.P. Chakraborty, B.C. Chabra, B.B. Mirasi, and also, of course, the doyen of Indian epigraphy, D.C. Sirkar. Now I'm coming to the second sections where I will be talking about the researches so far done based on epigraphic studies. As Sayantanidhi has already pointed out, that colonial and nationalist historians primarily used epigraphic data for writing dynastic histories, chain of kings and the conquest over others. Now this trend of historiography, as we know, focused particularly on a historical ruler. For example, the Ashokan edicts became the central theme for understanding the life of Ashoka and the political history of the Mauryas. Writing in an environment of freedom movement, the nationalist historians were in search for great Indian historical personalities. The discovery of Ashokan inscriptions thus helped them in projecting Ashoka as the unifier of the whole subcontinent around 3rd century BCE. In the same line, Samudragupta became the central figure of the Gupta dynasty around 4th century CE, based on his achievements portrayed in the Allahabad pillar inscriptions, while Vincent Smith equated him with Napoleon. The nationalist historian S.R. Goyal not only put him above Napoleon, but also put him above Ashoka as well. It was H.C. Raichaudhuri and U.N. Ghoshal who, beyond this dynastic history, also focused on some administrative issues. But by and large, the nationalist historians attempted to portray the image of a nationalist empire that existed in early India. Thus, R.C. Majumdar applied the idea of golden age and classical age for the Gupta rule. Since 1960 onwards, however, the focus shifted from the dynastic history to the socio-economic conditions over the dynastic history. Now, D.C. Sirkar played an instrumental role by drawing our attention to the socio-economic data that inscriptions generate beyond the administrative terms. However, the Marxist historiography brought a paradigm shift in understanding the history of early India. The idea of Indian feudalism initiated by D.D. Koshambi and R.S. Sharma can be taken as a starting point of this shift. The copper-plate charters recording donation of tax-free lands was one of the major sources that Sharma used to develop this formulation. According to him, the process of feudalization started during the time of the Guptas and consolidated under the multiplicity of powers during early medieval period, 7th to 11th, 12th century CE. A period that has been interpreted into nationalist historiography as the period of power struggle among the three powers, the Palas, Pratiharas, and Rashtrakutas, for the controlling over the Kannauj, for the control over Kannauj. While Sharma found the presence of fragmentary, decentralized authority during this period, Bartenstein found segmentary state in the context of South India from the times of Pallavas to the times of the Cholas. It is striking to note that using the same sources, the land grant charters, copper plate charters, B.D. Chattopadhyay and Hanuman Kulke opposed both fragmentation and segmentary models and developed a third model of state formation, the processual or the notion of integrative polity. B.D. Chattopadhyay's masterly study on the boundary markers mentioned in the copper plate charters in the context of donated land in early medieval India captured the image of the rural settlements. Later, Suchandra Ghosh has also worked on the boundary markers to understand the rural settlement or patterns of rural settlements of early Kamarupa. It established, as Shantanu rightly pointed out, that linkages among the villages, and which goes once again against the very notion of the very theory of isolation of villages. It goes against this theory. He also showed the presence, Chattopadhyay showed the presence of many new urban centers without an epicenter that led him to call this time the period of third urbanization. This is also the time when Ranavir Chakraborty found different types of exchange centers such as Hotto, Mondopika, Tenta, Nagaram, and argued against the theory of economic decline by focusing on the non-agricultural sector as well. Chakraborty's pull towards the coast further takes us to the study of maritime activities of the subcontinent through the lens of epigraphy, particularly in post-1000 CE, when we find the reference to Sanskrit Nauvittaka, a rich merchant of the ship, corresponds to the Arabic Persian Nakhuda, meaning the lord of the ship. The active participation of the Tamil merchants in the Indian Ocean trade network is attested by the rich corpus of epigraphic records studied by Noboru Karashima, Y. Subbarayalu, and their colleagues. It should also be noted here that Karashima's statistical analysis of the long inscriptions found from the temple walls of South India generated quantifiable data to capture the changing socio-economic and political-cultural scenario of the South Indian society. Now, coming back to the Indian Ocean scenario, it should also be mentioned that Indian inscriptions written in Sanskrit have also been found, and sometimes also in Prakrit, have also been found from countries of Southeast Asia, such as Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and some other countries, which shed light on the connectivity, on the connection of India with those distant lands. I won't go into the details of this, as Professor Chakraborty yesterday already had pointed out about these connections, particularly focusing on the Western Indian Ocean. He has talked about Ingo Strauch's works and mentioned about the role of the Socotra Island, where from the Sanskrit inscriptions ranging mostly between the 1st and 6th centuries have been recovered. Now I will come to the last sections of my talk, that is where I will try to tell about the recent trends and the newer possibilities. Now here I will focus on 3 subsections. First, I will be talking about the reissue of an old grant. A 6th century copper plate found from Taleshwara, Kumaon in central Himalaya introduced us with this tradition. These records belongs to Duti Burman, who was the ruler of a hill kingdom, Parvatakara Rajya, and records the donation of the land to Viraneshwara Swami, the incarnation of Ananta. It has been stated in line 11 of Duti Burman's records that the original grant was burnt, Dagdhani, therefore keeping the fear of Kali Yuga, when the greedy person tries to snatch away others' land. A request was placed before the ruler by the temple authority, Gogalikas, and some administrative officials to reissue a grant specifying the name and the size of the plots in 6th century CE. Now, considering this plea, it was imperative to reissue a new grant, becoming and by addressing during the donation of this grant, the rulers, by addressing Vigyapitam, all governmental and non-governmental officials, actually made them witness to the grant. The reissue of the grant, maybe on the basis of an earlier document, therefore speaks of a well-maintained record-keeping system and explains the linkage between the state formation and the written records. Needless to say that writing was an essential medium for record-keeping and communication, which started during the time of the Mauryas. In the present case, it happened in 3 stages. First, bringing the message of the ruler by the messenger, Dutaka, then writing Likhitam, and then engraving Utkirna. Now, another instance of efficient record-keeping system of the state can be found from early Bengal, thanks to the study of Roishuka Purui, that we have 184 Gupta-era copperplate grant of Vainagupta edited, that records the grant of many plots of land in favor of the Shanga of Ajivikas, who originally received the grant in Gupta era 91 from Nathochanda, a local chief. By using the term Yathaksharam, alphabet by alphabet, Vainagupta explicitly states that he copied the previous grant issued almost a century ago. The 7th century Nidhanpur copperplate of Bhaskaravarman is another example of reissuing a new grant, where the different writing styles of the last 2 imprecatory verses is justified along with the genuineness of the whole record. It states, and I quote, "Because after the burning of the plates, these newly written letters are of different form from the previous one, therefore they are not forged. Shasanadahad Arbhaga Avinava Lichitani Bhinna Rupani Tebha Aksharani Yashmat Tasman Vaitani Putani." Another slightly different example of this type can be found from Bhaskaravarman's friend Harshavardhana's record. His Madhuban copperplate captures the image of a cunning liar Brahmana. And here I quote the language of the inscription. "Be it known to you that having considered that this village of Somakondika has been enjoyed by the Brahman Bhamaratha on the strength of a forged edict, and having taken the village from him, I have granted him to his boundaries to Bhatto, Vatoswami, Shiva Deshwaswami, and a fellow student of Babri Chaputra." The reissuance of the old record continued in later times too, but the reference to forgery makes one suspicious and raises a question. Was the issuance of the new record always indicative of well-maintained record-keeping system of the state machinery, or the burning of the so-called old record became an easy way out for claiming a new grant? With these questions, we move on to the next section. In the second subsections, I will focus on the self-representation and presentations of others in epigraphical writing. Bili Chattopadhyay talks about the representation of the others. He focuses on the Sanskrit inscriptions and how those inscriptions portray the Muslims, but in this
Kumar, the sound you have, the sound has gone.
Is it coming?
Can you speak once more? Can you start once more from where you were starting with this new record? Because somehow the audibility is gone.
Am I audible now by the others?
No, we cannot hear you. Can you hear us?
Am I audible?
Can you hear us? Just raise your hand. If you can hear us, just raise your hand.
I can hear you.
We can hear him.
Dave, we can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. But somehow the voice is gone, Dave.
Voice is breaking,
the voice is gone. So I think that can you speak once more?
Now it is breaking.
Can you speak once more? His connectivity is also gone.
এবার শোনা যাচ্ছে?
Yes, we can hear you now.
We cannot hear you. Just let me see.
Ma'am,
if it is muted from here. No, you are on.
বাকিরা তো বলছে শোনা
The
যাচ্ছে ঠিক
microphone
আছে।
is on, but there is no sound emitting.
কিন্তু বাকিরা তো হাত তুলছে বলছে শোনা
Would you
যাচ্ছে।
like to try your phone instead of the device? Would you like to change your device? Like if you can shift to your mobile phone, maybe? Can you shift to your mobile phone and try whether that is making any sound?
Nupur, the others are saying that I am audible and I am speaking on my phone only. Okay, I am rejoining. Okay.
Connection is not working.
Nupur,
Nipurti, Tilottama is saying, please refresh your web page.
because we can. She has left them. Dev, you please continue.
Okay. So this next sections where I was talking, as B.D. Chattopadhyay has already shown us the way how to, in his monograph representing the others, and he shows us the uses of Sanskrit inscriptions and how they look
Can
at
the
the
others hear
Muslims
him?
with different.
Yes, we can hear him.
Please write in chat box because my. Okay, then fine. Go ahead.
Dev, please
Okay.
go ahead.
But
It's running out, please.
okay, the self-representation and presentation of others in epigraphical writing, this was actually a panel which was organized in last September by Professor Ennett Mitchell in Humboldt University, where many scholars tried to look at, particularly at the prosody sections of the inscriptions, and try to understand how those rulers try to portray themselves and also the others, particularly the relations with the subordinates. Sometimes they also talk about their enemies in vulgar languages. So not always on the prosody sections, like Suchandra Ghosh looked at the epigraphic sources to understand the portrayal of the forest people in between 3rd century BCE to 12th century CE. I tried to look at the representations of the Central Himalayan rulers through their records between 6th to 10th century CE. Natasja Bosma tried to look at the same thing by using the panegyrics, the prosodies, tried to look at the self-representations of the kings of the Dakshina Koshala during 6th to 7th century CE. Amandin, by analyzing the Somavansin dynasty's charters, looked at the use of the coronation name and raised a couple of questions like whether these were a mark of religious encroachment or a respectful expression or a statement of legitimacy or a political claim. Fudui looked at the struggle over Kaneuj and beyond by analyzing the copperplate charters of the Palas, Gurjara, Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas. Shamana Guru Raja juxtaposed the genealogies of the Hoysalas and their subordinates and tried to understand their interrelationships. Ennett herself looked at the copperplate charters of the Yadava dynasty to understand the self-representations of the rulers of the Yadava dynasty and compared that with Himadri's account. Luther overall interestingly looked at a Sanskrit inscription of 13th century found from Delhi Sultanate and tried to look how a merchant portrayed himself in the heart of the Delhi. Now, I'm moving quickly to my last sections, where I'll be talking about imprecatory verses of the inscriptions, where generally we find the warning, the abusive statement. Now, and can be found in the copperplate cards mainly, later also on stone inscriptions as well. Now, as I just said, that these verses were recorded as a warning, particularly for them who might cause harm to the grant at the end of the record. Now, I shall cite a few examples of this type, and I will request the 2 pictures that I have sent to Nupurti to share. Not right now, I'll come to, I'll tell you. First, and I'm thankful to Professor Chakraborty for drawing my attention to this issue, and also Sabani Pramanik Naik, who also supplied me certain references. First, I will focus on the Indore inscription of Skandagupta, which records a lamp grant and states, and I quote, "Whoever transgresses this grant that has been drawn up, that man, becoming as guilty as the slayer of a cow, or the slayer of a spiritual preceptor, or the slayer of a Brahmana, shall go to the infernal region, being overpowered with those well-known 5 sins together with minor ones." Now, what are these 5 sins? As Karasima rightly here points out, refers to the Manusmriti texts, where these 5 sins have been described, and these 5 sins are killing a Brahmana, drinking the Sura liquid, and stealing liquor, stealing the gold of a Brahmana, adultery with a guru's wife, and association with such offenders. These are 5 mortal sins, Pancha Mahapataka. Now, over time, the language of the inscriptions became vulgar. I'm skipping and going to 13th century record, Vaikundapuram inscription, which records tax remission of 4 villages by military leaders and states that the wife of the person who gives harm to this charity will be given to Pulayur. Now, these Pulayur are generally considered as the outcasts of Tamil Nadu. who cuts grass for the horses. Ratnagini inscriptions also belonging to the same time of 13th century CE, and I'm thankful to Karashima because of his translation, who violates an agreement stated in this record, and I quote, his eyes will be taken out and his nose will be cut. After dying, his body will be treated as those of pigs and dogs. Another instance from the 13th century comes from the Rajvita stone inscription of the time of Mohipaloda I, year 33 from early medieval Bengal, once again edited by Furui. And here I will request Nupurdi please to share the image, the first image that I have sent. Nupurdi, please share the photo. Okay, so the image has been taken from, the image has been taken from Furui's translation of this record. The record, while highlighting the presence and activities of the merchant groups of Bengal called Bonigrama, mentions the cars in words and graphic description as well. It states that whoever violates the object of the donation, I'm not going into the details of these donations, his father will be a donkey, his mother a pig, a woman pig, and his paternal uncle a camel. Annatha kurute tasya drishtena srimad devapadana antara adatta gardhava pita garta shukari mata ustrapitrebha bhavet shapatha iti. So far we have seen cars as the part of record. However, during the 14th century onwards, the cars became the central theme in an inscription which is known as the Gadegal, the ass cars. These are stone panel inscription recording the donation and sculptural depiction of donkey resting on a woman. The Gadegals have been found from various places such as Maharashtra, Gujarat, Goa, etc. Here I will cite only one example from Goa due to the paucity of time. Now the second image, please show the, Aditya please present, yeah, thank you. A 14th century record, this is a 14th century record now kept in Goa Museum. This image has been taken from Harshada D. Walkut's Gadegals from Goa article. Here the sun and the moon planks are shivering on the top of the inscription. So the sun and moon symbolizes that the grant is eternal, Chandra Surya, and shivering on the top, and sometimes it is substituted with a colosseum. The woman is seen facing the donkey whose forelegs are resting on her shoulder, the right side. Because of highly damaged the condition of the inscription, the language, it is written in Nagari, but the language is not clear. But we have other examples, several examples of this type coming from the Vijayanagara since 15th century onwards, where the cards inscriptions along with this type of sculptural depictions mentions that one who breaks the law stated by the grant will be guilty of Gohatta, cow killing, Brahmahatta, Brahmana killing, and Balahatta, child killing. And also that his mother will be copulated with a donkey in that pose which has been depicted here. So through this, I try to portray that the whispering of inscriptions, as Karashima calls it, highlights the proliferation of the abusive statement over the time through the languages of these land donation documents, and thereby certainly indicative of increasing social tension. And thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the most illuminating lecture. We will now move towards our discussion. We will first take question. Do you have any question?
See, we have to look at the...
Sorry, I also forgot to say that I'm thankful to Navamita Devbhumi for supplying me these two photographs. Thank you.
Sir, you have a question.
Yes, there is one question for Debu.
One question for Dev. I have a. This is from YouTube, Narendranath Moitro. Which inscriptions tells us about first land grant in ancient India? This is for Dev Kumar.
Okay. Is there any other question, or should I take the question together, or should I answer to this only?
No, please answer it.
Okay. See, the land grant records, particularly of the Shatavahanas, tell us about the earliest record which tell us about the land grant is the records of the Shatavahanas. So far, whatever we have found. But if we talk about the land grant records recorded in copper plate charters, then we have to look at the copper plate charters of the Vakatakas, then also of the Guptas. There are many. But yes, Satavahan records are the earliest evidences so far we have found.
Do you have any other question from the YouTube platform for other people?
If I can just, discuss that question that was asked. Is that okay? Follow me?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
surely.
that is fine.
Okay. So actually, that's something that I have been working on, and it's quite clear that the first land grant inscriptions that we have are from the reign of the Satavahanas. Now, the first inscription itself is the Nashik inscription of Gautamiputra Satakarni, which records, which records a land grant. And the first copper plate inscription that we have actually is the Patagandigutam copper plate inscription of this Ikshvaku ruler Ehwala Chantamula. So it's actually a case that we can look at the emergence of the tradition of land grants epigraphically from the early historic period onwards. So I have an article on this actually, which is called The First Land Grants.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Any other questions for Shantanu, ma'am?
We can wait for some time because things have to be kind of understood and it has to sink in for people to ask questions, because all the three papers were extremely informative and rich and dense with data as well as analysis. So I know that Meera, you have to leave early to pick up your daughter. So
no, ma'am, I still have another 40 minutes. So
okay. So we'll take some time and wait and see. See if those questions can come.
Ask whether there's any question for.
Thank you for pointing out this Patagandigutam has also written about it, but I didn't.
I can't hear you. Your voice is breaking. Dave, your voice is breaking. Can you please?
Dave, maybe just turn off your camera. That will work better.
You please turn off your camera and please speak again.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible now.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Meera, I think Harry Falk has also pointed out about these inscriptions which you just mentioned of the things. But have you written that article you were talking about, or you will be writing?
No, actually, there's this volume called The Social Worlds of Pre-Modern Transactions, which is brought out by Primus Books. So I have an article in that where I trace the emergence of the land grant tradition. On the Patagandigutam inscription, the latest version of it is actually available on this early inscriptions of Andhra database that I showed in my lecture. Ma'am, if we have time, can I ask a question? Actually, I had a question both.
Yes, of course.
Dave
yes,
and
of course. Yeah.
Shantanu, if that's fine. So,
Okay, please.
If I'll just start with Dave, one of the things that, struck me perhaps is the fact that if we chart, the historiographic lineage that you were talking about, the ways in which historians, have used inscriptions seem to have changed a lot over the years. So if we look at the early kind of studies, they seem to be more kind of dynastic. Then, as you pointed out, we had a lot of discussions on state formation and, understanding of state structures from inscriptions. But then we seem to have moved into a more kind of cultural domain. Or we have these very kind of specific studies of people editing, inscriptions. You pointed to the work of Rui and Arlo Griffiths, for instance. So do you think, what are the ways in which, for instance, you think inscriptions can still be used to write big picture stories? I was wondering if that's something you've thought about.
Yeah, in my last sections where I'm talking about the recent trends, this new, I was trying to point out to these new possibilities, like looking at this reissuance of the grant. I have seen at least 5 to 6 inscriptions where the present inscriptions, it is further stated that the earlier record was burnt. We do not know I'm just supposing that, okay, it was a well-maintained record-keeping system. That's why, depending on the previous record, but believing in the previous record, the original grant was issued. But this became a tradition. I mean, when we find these kinds of examples in more than one places, I mean, at least I have 5-6 examples, and this tradition is starting around 6th century CE. And from 6th century CE, in fact, I have 3 examples from 6th century CE, from Assam, Bengal, Central Himalaya. These areas are also connected, which I have shown in my thesis. I mean, there are many other issues which connects these 3 regions. So the issue of the grant cannot be just simply the burning of the record. So maybe a new trend is coming up to justify or to tell to issue a new grant. So this could be a new possibilities, I think. Second thing, which you told that this is the time when there's a considerable emphasis on the cultural history. That's true. I mean, in this panel, which I was mentioning, the self-representation and representation of the rulers, here we were mainly focusing on and it specifically told us to focus on the panegyrics, on the Prashasti sections, to understand how the rulers portrayed them and equated them sometimes with the mythical character. So this can be a new trend to look at the inscriptions from a different angle. And the third one, which I pointed out, that this social tensions are increasing, where Noboru Karashima has already worked on. There are multiple inscriptions, particularly from South India. I don't know why. I mean, maybe South Indians are much more expressive. So they are giving the details of that vulgar language. So why these vulgar languages are increasing? Is it just because of the social tensions, political conflict, or any other ways? So that can be looked at. So this can be another possibilities of looking at the inscriptions from different angles, beyond this general tendency of looking at beyond dynastic history or political history also. Can you hear me, Midadi?
We can continue with the discussions. If Meera and Shantanu, you have something to add on to it, then we are actually getting much enriched from your discussions.
Do we turn on cameras, Shantanu?
Yes, of course. Shantanu, are you there? You are there.
Yes, I'm there. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, it's not often that we get a chance to have conversations about epigraphy. So I'm making the most of this opportunity. So, one of the things that struck me about your paper is that in the inscription that you were talking about, you were saying that it's not a case where we can see, Brahmanas as some kind of separate varna, right? But that they're clustering among other communities. So that's something that I found quite interesting because, how do you think of inscriptions as a source of social history? So is that a patterning that's specific to that inscription, or would you say it's part of a regional patterning? Is it something that changes over time, or is it related to the expansion of caste society into Bengal, which is something, for instance, Professor Kunal Chakraborty was talking about in the first session in the morning. So just if you have any thoughts on this.
Yes, thank you, Meera, for this question. Actually, Ryosuke Furui has discussed this in detail in his thesis. The situation is that in the early period, in the 5th, 6th century land grant charters of North Bengal, we actually do not find the cohesion among the Brahmanas as a varna. And as I have already shown that they appear together with other groups of residents like the Kutumbins who were peasant householders. The Brahmanas appear along with them, as well as they also appear separately, because in these 5th, 6th century land grant charters, we have seen that the Brahmanas, one Brahmana and his wife, are donating land to a Jaina establishment. So Brahmanas appear in other social groups and they appear individually as well. But scholars like D.C. Sarkar and others, B.D. Chattopadhyay, Ryosuke Furui, all who studied about the social history in early Bengal, they have suggested that in this 6th century North Bengal, we do not find the cohesion among the Brahmanas as a Varna. It came at a later period with the settlement of the Agraharas. Their power gradually increased. And this has been discussed in detail by Ryosuke Furui in his thesis.
Okay, thanks.
So we do not have any questions coming from either YouTube or here in the Google Meet. Polomi, would you like to conclude?
Okay, ma'am. Okay, surely. Thanks to all the three eminent speakers of this session. This brings us to the end of day 2. We thank all the eminent speakers for enriching our understanding of early Indian history. Thanks to everyone who had joined here today. There are some announcements to be made by Professor Dasgupta. Over to you, ma'am.
Yes, thank you, Polomi. I would once more thank all the resource persons who had kindly agreed to join us on this platform. And it has been a tremendous experience for us, the faculty, as well as the students and research scholars who participated in this. These 2 days, yesterday and today, we have been much enriched by the rich discussions, the presentations, and the ways that visuals and texts and inscriptions and the field had been opened before us as and a new vista of researchers in early Indian history I hope that it has really opened up before the research scholars and the young postgraduate students. I would also like to express my deep gratitude to my friend and colleague, Professor Shuchandra Ghosh, without whose kind help, I would not have been able to kind of frame this workshops program or to get hold of so many eminent speakers, especially Professor Osman Bopirachi, Dr. Meera Vishwanathan, and Professor Parul Pandyadhar. Because the rest of them are closer to me, I had not been very familiar with these 3 eminent scholars, but it is due to Professor Shuchandra Ghosh that I have been able to kind of get hold of them. Oh, there is a general query. Oh, this is very good. There is a general query from Sribarna Ghosh, and anybody can take it up, or all of you can take it up. So this is, many inscription mentioned punishments if the content of the inscriptions were stopped or discontinued. I mean, that is the directives in the inscriptions were stopped or continued. But this is a general, what is a question? This is a comment. This is just a comment. Anyway, would you like to kind of, any one of you or one or two of you would like to comment
would you
on
like
this?
to answer this? This is Chandrani.
Okay, the punishment.
Okay, Dave.
Okay, I don't. Okay, I was talking about the punishments, and punishment, I will say that it did not stop, but over the time, what I showed also, it became, much more vulgar. The language became much more vulgar, and it actually became much more elaborate as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
So as I was going on to say, with this thanks, we are kind of taking off to the new, new sections tomorrow. Tomorrow's sessions will start from 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. in the morning, and we have chapters on medieval and early modern history. Yes, Tilotama has posted the message in the chat box. For all those who are interested to participate, we would really, really welcome to see you all on this platform once more tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you very much once more, and a nice day to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.